Picture it a winter night on the far edge of Wales, the 28th of January 1457. The sea is a black lung drawing breath against the limestone cliffs below Pembroke Castle, and inside those walls a single human sound keeps returning to the stones, a girl's scream, thin at first, then hoarse, then hardly human at all. The wind is doing its own work beyond the arrow slits, sanding the night with ice and blown salt, but here in a chamber ringed with candles the draught turns each flame into a shivering witness. A child, 13, small even for 13, clutches at linen, already stained dark, breathing in quick, frightened gasps as another contraction climbs through her. Lady Margaret Beaufort has been taught to kneel, to curtsy, to read the Psalms. No one can teach a body this. The midwives murmur to one another in low Welsh, and Latin fingers, slick gestures, practiced faces set in that expression professionals wear when they are praying they will not need their most dangerous skills. Someone moves another brazier closer. The smoke collects beneath the rafters heavy with rosemary and a little dried lavender, the old remedies meant to calm, to strengthen, to ward away bad air and worse spirits. The chamber is bright in a narrow way, candles stacked everywhere like a besieging army, but beyond the circle of light the stone reminds you what winter means. Margaret's hair has pasted itself to her cheekbones. She stretches for breath, and the sound that comes out could belong to an animal. There is a lot of blood for someone so small. The older midwife, a woman whose hands have delivered more children than she cares to remember, glances once at her assistants and does not need to speak. They all know what they are seeing: a child's hips, a large child within. This is the arithmetic of danger. Outside Pembroke's great round keep shoulders the night. Snow frets along the curtain walls, gathering on ledges that will be bare again by morning when the wind has its say. Down below, waves detonate against rock that has outlasted kings. History is not bothered by weather, but people are. Inside, history is being born as painfully as it ever has been. The mother is the orphaned daughter of a disgraced commander, the heiress of a line that leads back to John of Gaunt, and an awkward clause of law that can bless your blood and still curse your future. The father is already dead, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, captured at Carmarthen the previous autumn and gone before winter properly began. His brother Jasper has gathered the girl widow into this fortress to keep her from the civil war that is about to overtake the entire realm. He is pacing on cold flags just beyond the door, listening because there is nothing else he can do. The prayers begin again, spoken more to the mother than to heaven. Breathe here, push now, rest while you can look at me. Margaret does as she is told because doing is the only way through. She is bright. Everyone says so clever with accounts, quick with languages and liturgy. But there is no cleverness here, only a long road that must be walked in the dark. The midwives shift her, change the angle, argue quietly, try again. There's a moment, a long moment, when the candles seem to dim and the whole room leans toward the bed, as if pulled by a tide. No one says it out loud, the fear that keeps touching their mouths. She is too young, the child is too big. We may lose both. Even the priest, who has been hovering in the chapel, starts bargaining with God the way people do when they have run out of words and want to trade their sleep, their future, their anything. Another contraction breaks across her, like surf. Margaret's fingers twist the sheet until the fabric snaps. She has been at this for hours, time counted not by clocks but by how many times someone has wrung out a cloth and how many candles have guttered into puddles of wax. The older midwife makes a decision that will not be written down. She and her assistants work with a composure that looks like calm and is in fact discipline. They change tactics. The girl cries out again, one more sound that the stones will keep. It is suddenly astonishingly quiet. Then a sound arrives that is both familiar and always new, a thin, angry wail that means there is life. The midwife clears the child's mouth, rubs him down, and he lifts his voice properly. The air moves again in the room. Somebody laughs and cries at once. Jasper outside stops pacing without knowing why. They lay the child, still wet and loud, on his mother's chest for an instant, because this is what you do even when your patient is 13 and nearly emptied of strength. She tries to lift her head to see him. Her arms don't quite obey her. She looks anyway, eyes widened, fixing the small face as if memorizing is the only safety left to her. We know his name. Henry Tudor, though that name will change the arithmetic of England only years from now, when he has outlasted storms, exile, and the fiercest of kings. Tonight he is an infant who does not understand crowns or roses, white or red. The irony that people like to make out of this, that a child born into such agony will one day end the bloodiest quarrel of the age, and found a dynasty, does not belong to the room. There is too much work still to do. The midwives are not thinking of Bosworth Field or heraldry. They are thinking of blood loss and linen, and how to move a body that is shaking from the shock of what it has done. Margaret drifts in and out. Fevers come later. For the moment it is only the drowning weariness of having survived. She has always leaned toward prayer, but by the time this night is fully behind her, that leaning will become a discipline, a scaffolding she can climb to see a little above her fear. People will say she took her suffering and hammered it into piety so hard that it rang. They will be right, but not yet. Now she is a child whose body has done something it was barely able to do, whose future has narrowed and sharpened at once. She will almost certainly never bear another child. She will live with that knowledge the way people in winter live with the cold by setting more fires and pretending they are enough. Outside the walls, the wars of the roses are already moving in the dark like weather systems gathering over distant hills. York and Lancaster cousins with the same great-grandfather, and different answers to a question the realm keeps refusing to settle. None of this matters to a newborn. All of it matters to a mother whose bloodline makes her both prize and target. The Beaufort name is a ladder that reaches high and a trap door that opens under your feet. Tonight in this room that complexity is sleeping in a cradle someone has hastily lined with fur against the drafts. The castle will remember. Stones do that not because they feel, but because they hold the traces of what we shout at them. If you were to stand years from now beneath the same rafters and listen very hard, you might hear the echo that began a dynasty, the long tearing cry of a child giving birth to a child. And if you were to step out onto the wall walk and look south toward the black water, you might think the Atlantic is still repeating something. It heard that night some promise about how suffering and power are always buying one another with the same coins. We will follow that promise and its cost. We will walk back from this bed to a childhood in Bedfordshire, to a father's ruin, and an early betrothal that dissolved like salt. We will watch a kingdom divide itself along lines that it pretended were about law, but were really about fear and pride and memory. We will see how a girl turned grief into a weapon, and how a mother taught a king how not to lose himself. If stories like this, quiet rooms where history changes its mind, speak to you, stay with us. Add your voice to the small chorus that carries these lives forward. For now a brazier fades. A midwife sits down at last. A girl sleeps the sleep of the nearly dead. In a few hours the winter light will find them look upon their work and decide to let them go on. Remember the date if you want a peg to hang the rest of the tale on the 28th of January 1457, Pembroke Castle, a life begun inside a fortress, a realm about to be remade outside it. The girl in that chamber is not simply any noble daughter broken upon the wheel of childbirth. She carries as the older women whisper when they think she cannot hear the blood of kings. The phrase is a charm and a warning both. Margaret Beaufort is a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of King Edward III, and of Gaunt's third wife Catherine Swynford, whose name still arrives in courtly conversation like a perfume that unmakes a room. From those two came the Beauforts, a line both sanctified and suspect, made legitimate in law, and yet forever footnoted by how it began. To be a Beaufort is to feel the cold of a church floor through your knees and the heat of political fire at your back often in the same hour. Start with the story that England likes to tell itself when the nights grow long. A Prince John of Gaunt falls in honest love with a woman who is not a princess. She has learned loyal and already the mother of his children when he finally marries her. The realm breathes in with the romance and out with the problem. Their children, John, Henry, Thomas and Joan, are made legitimate by royal letters in 1397, and the church nods and Parliament records the nod. A decade later, Gaunt's son, by a different marriage, seizes a crown as Henry IV, and carefully repeats the blessing with a qualifier folded into the parchment like a blade in velvet. The Beauforts are fully legitimate, yes, except a dignitas, regale except for the royal dignity. The words are calm. Their afterlife is not. Men will spend the next century arguing whether that clause is iron or cobweb, whether it bars a Beaufort from the throne itself, or merely timid minds from imagining it. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, is born into this equivocal grace. He inherits not only a name that can open any door in England, but also the knowledge that someone is always waiting to close it again. He is the second son of the first Beaufort Earl, a soldier by expectation more than aptitude, sent to France to fight the final ruinous chapters of a war England no longer knows how to win. He returns in 1444 with honour frayed and fortunes thin. The court calls his death fever, Because it must call it something, the servants say less, which says more. He leaves behind a baby daughter and a widow who understands that in this realm widows and children are not sheltered by pity so much as priced by it. Margaret grows up at Bletsoe Manor, and moated stronghold in Bedfordshire, taught to trace her lineage like a map of both roads and ambushes. On her mother's side, the Beauchamps and St. John's stitch her into the fabric of the shires. On her father's, the red thread runs to Edward III. The lesson is simple, and endless bloodlines are a ledger. What you are worth is written in them, and what you are owed is written there too, but so are the liens held by those who would use you. Under English law, the Crown claims wardship over minors who inherit lands. With wardship comes control of marriage. The king may grant that gift to a favourite who may betroth the child to profit himself, not her. This is not tragedy or outrage to the century, it is administration. Papers are read aloud, sums are agreed. A girl becomes a hinge upon which two houses swing. So when the familiar refrain returns, Lady Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the blood of kings, it is not a benediction but a sentence. That blood can lift a young woman into the centre of the realm's calculations, and with equal ease paint a target between her shoulders. In a country about to divide itself into white and red roses, kinship to Edward III is a lit match in a dry field. The House of York will claim a purer seniority reaching back through Lionel of Antwerp, Edward's second son, by way of Mortimer descent. The House of Lancaster will answer with continuity. Henry IV, V, and VI are already kings, and kingship is a habit that begets its own legality. Between these cousins and their counsellors lies a chasm bridged by parchment, pride, and steel. When the bridge fails, the realm will fall through. In that landscape, the Beauforts are both ladder and lightning rod. A legitimized branch means they are of the royal tree, undeniably, and also that there are men willing to insist they are not of it enough. The distinction is useful whenever a lawyer needs a thesis or a commander needs a cause. It is less useful to a girl who must live inside it. Margaret learns early that every conversation about her future begins somewhere else in courts, where seals are warmed and impressions made in chambers where men measure advantage with their thumbs on the scale. She is exceptional, quick, precise, devout, and none of that matters as much as whose granddaughter she is. There is too what blood makes you to other women. Queens and duchesses look at Margaret and see an instrument they could wield, or a hazard they must blunt. Mothers remember their own daughters and count forward the years wondering what price will be demanded of them. Servants and midwives whose genealogies are written in service rather than silk recognize in her a body no different from theirs and a fate that is. When they whisper that her blood is both blessing and curse, they are not being poetic. They are naming the economy that will move her from betrothal to betrothal, from safety to danger and back again. The law follows the blood like a hound. The letters that once sanctified the Beauforts will be turned around and read backward when it suits the reader. Does accepta dignitate regali mean may never rule or ought not claim or simply need not be considered while stronger candidates stand? Ask the parchment. It will tell you whatever the hand upon it asks it to say. Henry VI pieable trusts his Beaufort kin. Their loyalty has wrapped his reign even as his wits unravel. Richard of York sniffs opportunity and precedent like a hunting dog in cover. The realm becomes a room where men argue quietly about Latin and proceed noisily to solve their translation problems with swords. For Margaret, the practical consequences begin at 6 years old when betrothal becomes her first language. Documents lace her to John de la Pole, son of the king's powerful minister, the Duke of Suffolk, a plan that will dissolve in seawater and blood when Suffolk is murdered in 1450. Another parchment will take its place, then another. The point is not love, not even companionship. It is access who gets the Beaufort lands, who gains the right to call themselves kin to John of Gaunt through her. The crown parcels out that access as patronage and policy. Margaret herself becomes the gift. And yet blood is not simply liability, it is also leverage. In an age that pretends to worship chivalry but truly venerates lineage and cash, Margaret can make rooms listen by entering them. She can negotiate from positions that would be shut to women of equal intelligence but lesser birth. She will carry petitions, mediate quarrels, and arrange marriages that knit wounds. No statute can suture. Even the piety that will later define her is sharpened by pedigree. The chaplains who would glance past a lesser lady will stand still when the king's great-granddaughter asks them to hear her confession or copy her books. When we say that in the savage political landscape of 15th century England such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a dangerous threat, We must add the quieter truth that many lives are both at once. Margaret's path will prove it. The king's favour will reach for her. Regional magnates will jostle to be the hand that guides, the shield that guards, or the jailer that confines. Each time a crown wobbles, her name will brighten on one faction's list and darken on another's. Each fresh victory in the field will redraw her risk map without moving her an inch. She will learn to read those maps, to anticipate the turns, to lay scaffolding across the gaps, so that when the bridge collapses under some grander person's feet, hers will hold. For now, hold the essentials. John of Gaunt's line runs through her. The law both blesses and limits that line. The kingdom's quarrel about who should be king is really a quarrel about what blood means. Margaret, barely 14 when she becomes a mother, will be asked to solve that quarrel with patience instead of armies. Her son will inherit not only her blood but its argument. He will someday answer, "Accepta dignitate regali," not with a tract, but with a coronation. Between this winter birth and that future summer field stretch 30 years of calculation and courage. The first sums are simple heiress plus wardship equals marriage as policy. The later sums will be stranger exile plus promise plus timing equals a crown. But even the deep arithmetic begins here, with a child who is valuable because of who her great-grandfather was, and dangerous because of what someone might make of that value. The day will come when she chooses her protectors with more skill than they choose their causes, when her household becomes a listening post, when her faith becomes not only solace but strategy, and all along beneath every choice there will always be the same melody, blood humming like a taut string vibrating at the touch of history's clumsy fingers. Remember this about her lineage, because her enemies will. It is both door and dagger. Remember it because she must. And remember it because without that thread the tapestry that we call Tudor unravels in an instant. Before the winter sea and the chamber of candles there was Bedfordshire flat fields stitched with hedgerows, low sky, and a moated house that was both manor and small fortress. Bletsoe. In late May 1443 there Margaret Beaufort was born to Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe and John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset. It was a birth that looked ordinary on the outside. Women warm water whispered prayers, and not ordinary at all on paper. The infant came trailing signatures, Gaunt Plantagenet Beaufort. Even the nurse who first swaddled her would have known the names that bent over the cradle, for names were currency, protection, and hazard in equal measure. By the time the baby's first autumn came around, the talk in the hall was about France. It was always about France, but now the weather had turned in earnest. Years earlier, Henry V had ridden his bright legend into the continent and nailed English banners to towns like names to doors. Now those banners sagged, the nails were loosening. John Beaufort, Margaret's father, had been sent to arrest the slide and came home with the slide, having learned his name. It is not that he was a coward. It is that he walked into a war whose tide was turning underneath the surface where courage cannot breathe. He returned in 1444, thinner in spirit than in body, a man of high birth and higher expectations, who had found himself commanding men who expected miracles, and received instead the arithmetic of reality, exhausted treasuries, frayed alliances, and enemies who had learned patience. Servants talk. They said he stared too long into hearths, as if consulting a prophet in the coals, ate without tasting, slept badly, and woke up worse. Gentlemen at court noticed the same things, and called it melancholy, because they needed a word that would pass in polite company. He was not old, barely 40, but disappointment can age a person faster than winters do. On the 27th of May 1444, the House learned new vocabulary, sudden fever found. The official version required a closed mouth and a straight face, and those were supplied. The unofficial versions took shapes that fit the holes the official one left. Poison A blade his own hand. It is a feature of noble deaths in troubled times that they spawn theories like pools spawn gnats. The facts that mattered to the infant in the cradle were simpler and unforgiving. The Duke was dead. His daughter was fatherless. The Beaufort name, glorious and compromised, would now have to do its work through a girl child and a widow. So Bletsoe became a school. Margaret Beauchamp taught her namesake the subtraction and addition of life. Subtraction first, her husband, her surest protection, subtracted. What remains must learn to add. Add patrons and choose them. Add alliances and bind them with parchment thick enough that even winter rats cannot gnaw through. Add learning Latin enough to pray and to read what men do not like women to read. Accounts enough to know where the money went before someone tells you a story about it. memory enough to recall who smiled in which room and why. The moated house was not large, but the world can be large inside a small place if you are being prepared to survive it. The child moved through the rooms with quiet steps, listening. History is made in fields, but it is also made in the gaps between sentences, in pauses after names. The household priest taught her to shape her mouth around the psalms and to hold her mind steady as a candle flame when prayers pulled at it. The steward who pretended not to notice that she was watching taught her by demonstration how a ledger becomes a map of duty and danger rents due from men whose sons had gone to war and might not return, gifts from neighbours that were both kindness and signal, the cost of meat when the king's progress came too near. Her mother taught her how to write letters that meant three things at once: what they seemed to say, what the recipient would hear, and what the man who opened them in the middle might completely miss. Of her father there were stories. A gold-chased sword he had carried at a wedding feast long before her birth. A gesture he used to make when thinking thumb, worrying his signet as if trying to rub out his own device. The day his horse threw a shoe, and he walked the last mile home, rather than ride lame, because it mattered to him that the animal not pay for his haste. People tell stories like these when the larger story refuses to sit still. They turn a failed campaign into a series of moments in which the man inside the failure can be seen. Margaret absorbed those too, without the luxury of believing that affection changes outcomes. The ruin of one man's reputation had become the scaffolding of a little girl's future. Outside Bletsoe, the kingdom was starting to develop its permanent headache. Henry VI, pious and gentle, could be persuaded by a liar and destroyed by a storm of bad luck. His counsellors were already gathering around him in neat factions like clouds pulling themselves into weather. The de la Poles, the Nevilles, the Percys, and always the great shadow of the House of York, tracing its line back to Edward III's second son and writing in the air with that fact as if it were a spell. The Beauforts, Margaret's kin, had built their chapel of influence in the previous generation under Cardinal Henry Beaufort, a man who could balance a budget and a king's soul with the same steady hand, but he was gone now. The work of staying relevant fell to cadet branches, widows, and the careful deployment of marriages. Wardship made the crown the silent third parent in any conversation about a child like Margaret. To be a minor with lands was to be a prize the king could bestow, along with the right to arrange your marriage upon whom he pleased. It was not unusual, it was policy. But to live under policy is to feel its weight. The first paper chains snapped on early a betrothal to John de la Pole's Suffolk son, which seemed solid until the channel ran red with Suffolk's end. When pirates or patriots dragged the Duke from his ship and worked at his neck with a clumsy sword, they were not merely committing a murder. They were re-editing the future of a girl inland who had never seen the sea. In the meantime, Margaret grew as far as her bones would permit. She was slender, as little as any mother wants a daughter to be in a world that will ask too much of her body. She excelled at reverence, which is different from submissiveness when practiced by the intelligent. Her devotion was a practice as deliberate as her penmanship, though it would later thicken into something steelier after Pembroke. Even now, though, the chapel at Bletsoe was a place where her mind could stretch in Latin cadences that made order of the disorder outside. Piety for her began as a way to hold still in a moving room. Visitors came and went, cousins with news heralds with warrants, messengers with letters from London that smelled faintly of the river. Margaret learned to read the language of arrivals which servants hurried, which did not. How loudly boots struck stone, whether the horses in the yard steamed with effort or stood easy. She learned the etiquette of danger. Never ask the one question you most want to know until you are sure the answer will not be repeated louder elsewhere. She learned, too, the economic truth that hides beneath coats of arms. Debt humbles dukes and elevates clothiers. A well-run estate is a kind of fortress. People sometimes say that Margaret's will was forged by later events, by widowhood, by the knife-edge birth, by exile and return. It was forged here first, in the way her mother kept a household in good heart without the man whose name still hung above the hearth, in the careful schooling that taught a girl she must not only be good but useful, in the knowledge that the law would not be her advocate unless she learned to speak it aloud, and to hire those who spoke it better still. Every later decision, whom to trust, how to wait, when to write, and when to ride, rests on foundations poured at Bletsoe, and always the father, not a ghost so much as a portrait you keep seeing from the corner of your eye. In the official record, he is a date and a title. In the family's memory, he is the man whose hand hovered at his signet, the soldier who came home with winter in his eyes, the duke who could not bear the arithmetic that his war had written. In Margaret's life, he is the first absence around which everything else arranges itself. It is a hard education for a child, but a clear one. Reputations break. Plans change in other rooms, and the only safe dowry is what you can carry in your head and your spine. The small girl in Bedfordshire did not yet know about Pembroke, or Bosworth, or Westminster pavement under a Queen Mother's tread. She knew the moat's green skin in summer, the way reeds move when a wind begins far away, and how to hear news before anyone says the word that holds it. She knew without being told that her name could open doors or open traps. She learned to step through anyway, measuring the floor as she went. Paper makes soft noises when it changes the course of a life. At Bletsoe, wax-hard seals neat Latin, and the dry crackle of folded parchment announced that the Crown had taken notice of a small girl and her large inheritance. Wardship first, because the King claims the care of minors with lands as a matter of right, and then the thing that follows wardship as thunder follows heat marriage. In 1444 the royal favour fell upon William de la Pole, the man who stood closest to Henry VI's ear. Suffolk, as he would soon be received, the profitable stewardship of Margaret Beaufort's future, and did precisely what power does. When handed the pen, he wrote his own family into hers. A betrothal bound 6-year-old Margaret to Suffolk's boy John de la Pole. The language was clear, and cold lands to be settled, portions to be paid, alliances to be cemented. No one used the word love unless they were joking. This was not villainy so much as system. Among magnates, betrothal is a kind of credit instrument dated forward. The paper fixes expectations: who will control estates when a minor comes of age, whose men will garrison which castles, where rents will flow, who will sit at which end of a council table 10 winters from now. Dower and jointure are the gears, consents the oil. The bride and groom, often no taller than the table upon which the seal is pressed, are named principals in a transaction whose real parties are their elders. If all goes well, years later there will be a ceremony and a feast, and those who drew the papers will pretend they foresaw affection the whole time. Suffolk did not invent this world, he simply used it better than most. He had taken England's frail king by the hand, and walked him into a marriage with Margaret of Anjou in 1445, wrapping that treaty in promises to end France's hunger for English towns, without requiring any money the Exchequer did not have. The fine print came due slowly, and then all at once. Maine and effectively Anjou, hard-won places, soaked with the memory of Henry V's banners, were bargained away in stages. The realm grumbled, the realm howled. Suffolk kept smiling, a professional habit. It is not that he loved France more than England. It is that he loved arrangements, clever ones that turned today's danger into tomorrow's manageable loss, and England had run out of days when loss could be made to look like anything else. When the tide of resentment finally lifted a name to carry its foam, it lifted his. In 1450, Parliament impeached him. The king, ever mild, banished him for 5 years, as if temper could be exiled like a troublesome hound. Suffolk boarded a ship called the Nicholas of the Tower. Men loyal to no badge, but anger stopped her in the channel. What happened next was theatre, and punishment bound together a rough plank, a kneeling figure, a blade that made a mess of the job. The sea witnessed the rest. His headless body came in with the tide near Dover. It was an end full of vulgar symbolism, which is to say it was perfect for the moment. In Bletsoe's hall the news arrived, as it always does on horseback, wet with weather, told carefully the first time, and less carefully after. Someone took the de la Pole parchment down from the coffer and read it again, as if words might have fermented into safety. But paper is not wine. What protects you today can shrivel into tinder when the hand that wrote it is removed. Henry VI's household scavenged Suffolk's patronage for parts. Enemies crowed, friends looked for new roofs under which to shelter, and somewhere in the churn of it all a little girl's future slid its track. The betrothal did not explode. It dissolved, which is how most impossibilities become facts. In 1453 the match was formally annulled. In practice, it had already stopped breathing the day the Nicholas was taken. If you listen for sadness in the household, you will not find it. People there had few illusions that a de la Pole marriage meant peace as much as profit. The emotion that moved through the rooms was calculation, the alertness that accompanies a change of weather. Margaret's mother, who knew the value of an hour, went to work. Alliances are not broken, they are replaced. The question was not whether the girl would be married, but to whom, and with what geometry of gain and protection. You could turn to a house long rooted in the shires and find steadiness. You could turn to a new star and find only heat. The trick was to guess whose light would last. Meanwhile, London discovered how much it enjoyed its own voice. Jack Cade's rebellion that same year shouted the name of evil counsellors into every alleyway, a convenient litany that spared the king while men along the Strand watched their windows. Cade, whatever else he was, understood theatre and petition both. For a few hot weeks the city believed that parchment and poleaxes might yet mend one another. They did not, but the performance left marks. It taught the realm how swiftly a grievance could become a crowd, and how swiftly a crowd could become a politics. Margaret was too young to see it firsthand. She was old enough to hear how fast a name can curdle when spoken by a mob. If you want to understand what betrothal meant to a girl like Margaret, pull the papers to pieces and read the parts aloud. There is the settlement land now and promises later. There is the dower, what the bride may rely upon if left a widow, a clause more certain for the well-born than for the well-loved. There is the jointure property assigned to support a wife in lieu of dower, rolling thicker in these years as lawyers learn new tricks. There are penalties for default alliances to be shored with marriages among cousins, and the careful swapping of sureties as if people were guarantors upon loans. Behind every clause is the quietly stated premise that wombs move wealth. Who controls the marriage controls the passage of acres from one surname to another. Margaret learned these lessons by osmosis long before she learned them by dictation. She saw the way her mother's face changed when letters arrived bearing the king's hand, the sudden brightness when a neutral cousin offered hospitality at the right moment, the way a steward's pencil paused over a column of figures when news from court was bad. Children of her rank are trained not only to read but to be read, to hold their expressions in a register that means nothing to the wrong eyes and everything to the right ones. If she asked softly what would happen next, she was given tactful answers that God provides, that friends remain, that the king's justice is sure. If she asked nothing, she learned more. Suffolk's fall left a vacuum close to the throne, and vacuums do what vacuums always do, they pulled. Richard, Duke of York, felt the new suction. So did the Nevilles, who were becoming a weather system of their own. The crown, thin-voiced and soft-handed, tried to reassume what it had pawned, the profitable duty of arranging futures like furniture in a room. And it was then that another name began to drift, almost gently at first, across the talk: Tudor. Welsh roots, an origin story that makes chroniclers purse their lips. And most importantly, two young men, Edmund and Jasper, whom the king himself had raised from nothing to earldoms because affection is the only coin he spends lavishly. For a mother, choosing where to anchor a daughter's life favour like that can be more practical than any grandmother's pedigree. But that is next. For the moment, picture only a coffer of papers in a Bedfordshire manor, and a woman sorting them like a fortune-teller with decks of cards. This one is useless now. This one may yet be pressed into service. This one needs to be quietly returned to the man who sent it before it accuses us by remaining. The little girl is not in the room. She is kneeling in the chapel, learning to keep her back straight when the stone is cold. Above her head, the painted saints preach patience, which may be the most political of the virtues if you live long enough. Years later, when people say she was lucky to marry where she did, they will mean that luck came to a house that had made itself ready for it. Paper did not stop rustling in England in 1450, but it changed tone. It began to sound more often like orders, and less often like plans. Men would ride, and soon colours would be stitched onto sleeves in the name of flowers that never asked to be enlisted. And when the next parchment came to Bletsoe, this one summoning Margaret to a match with Edmund Tudor, the king's half-brother in everything but law, it would carry not only a promise but a warning. A life can be made out of documents, but only if you remember that documents burn, and you must be swift enough to write the next one before the ash settles. Before the name Tudor was a banner at Bosworth, it was a story people told in lowered voices about a queen who fell in love. Catherine of Valois, widow of the lion-bright Henry V, had been penned about by a statute in 1428 that said a dowager queen could not remarry without the king's consent, a tidy way for counsellors to guard the royal womb from making inconvenient alliances. Consent in this case meant the assent of a child, Henry VI, her son, a boy so gentle that his reign would be full of other men's decisions. Catherine's answer to the statute, if we read the annals with a generous eye, was to fall in love with a Welsh gentleman of quiet charisma named Owen ap Maredudd. Owen Tudor to the English tongue. Whether they married secretly or lived in a sanctified defiance that later chroniclers politely called marriage hardly mattered to their children. Edmund and Jasper were born into a fog of disapproval and gossip, and were brought into the sun by the one person whose opinion could overrule the room, their half-brother the king. In 1452, Henry VI wrapped legitimacy around them like cloaks and called them earls, Edmund of Richmond, Jasper of Pembroke. It was a king's way of answering the old statute: if the law hedged a woman's future, the crown could at least honour her sons. The Tudor brothers were not Plantagenets, not in the strict line, but they were family by blood and affection, and in a court that mistook mildness for weakness, the favour Henry showed them was steel. Welsh upstarts, the nobility sniffed as if a valley birth were a stain that water could not wash. And yet, when the king wished something done in the marches, when he wanted a loyal fist closing around a troublesome shire, it was Jasper he trusted. He gave him Pembroke, and with it the hard school of frontier rule, castles, tire of occupants who do not learn. This is the heir that carried a new parchment toward Bletsoe in 1455. The match it proposed rewrote Margaret Beaufort's future with 3 words: Earl of Richmond. Edmund was perhaps 24, military and court-seasoned, a man Henry VI loved as kin and instrument. Margaret was 12. The Latin of the contract sat calm on the page, but any woman in the room understood its rough translation. The crown is binding the Beaufort name to a favourite whose star is still climbing. Heiress joins earldom. Lands and loyalties pass through a girl's body. Under English common law, wardship gave the king power to order such a match. Under canon law, marriage depended upon consent, and under canon law, consent could be spoken by a girl of 12. There were kinds of consent verba de futuro, promises about tomorrow, that could be broken without censure, and verba de presenti, words that made 2-1 today, and lawyers could spend a winter arguing about which syllable had been said. None of it altered the physics of a realm where parchment measured desire and duty both. They married likely on All Saints' Day 1455 at Bletsoe, a date the chroniclers favour, and a place that keeps the story within the house where her childhood had been tutored into vigilance. There would have been a chapel bright with candles, and as much celebration as prudence allowed musicians, banners knotted to poles, a table loaded so generously that even the lower hall tasted the day's happiness. Edmund would have looked every inch a king's kinsman, fur at the collar, a chain that caught the candlelight, and Margaret would have looked as girls look when sewn into women's brocade, small within its shine, practised at stillness. By nightfall the legal work was done. The rest, the kind that leaves marks the law does not see, began where witnesses were not invited. People have argued at safe distances of centuries about whether consummation should have waited. Canonists, tutored by prudence, said yes, defer marital cohabitation until puberty. Gentlemen with a keen interest in heirs often said no. The world Margaret inhabited was not an ideal. It was a practice, and the practice among magnates was that a contract made with the king's blessing need not wait upon a girl's bones to finish growing. The bedchamber in such stories is made to bear too many purposes: dynastic vault, treaty room, counting house. There is nothing modern to be gained by describing that wedding night as anything but harm made respectable by custom. Margaret would never, in words that have survived, tell that part of her life. Her body told it instead. What Edmund wanted from the match was not a mystery. The Beaufort connection brought prestige and possibility. The Beaufort estates brought cash and leverage. A son would bring security that parchment alone could not. He was not a monster for wanting these things. He was an earl in a century that rewarded men who secured them efficiently. He spent the next months doing a king's work in Wales, where efficiency sometimes meant the hard arithmetic of campaign and counter-raid. In the autumn of 1456, he rode into Carmarthen and did not ride out. The capture was brisk. The explanation for his death weeks later was brisker illness in confinement, said the official note, plague perhaps. Men who had seen enough prisons to distrust polite endings muttered alternatives: murder tucked into the folds of a convenient fever, neglect given leave to finish the job. It changed nothing for the girl who had been made a wife. She was 13, carrying a child and a widow. Jasper Tudor came to her like a wall. If Edmund had bound Beaufort blood to Tudor fortune, Jasper would keep the knot from being cut. He moved Margaret west and south to Pembroke, where his authority ran down into cellars and up onto battlements. Watch the roads that winter in your mind. Ruts frozen into iron hedges, shivering with sleet carts that foundering horses could not pull without swearing. The litter that carried her jolted at every hidden stone, and each jolt sent pain through a body that had been asked to work ahead of its making. She crossed a country narrowing into war, York and Lancaster, rehearsing old arguments with new swords. The girl inside the curtains rode between factions like a coin not yet minted, valuable because of what could be stamped upon her future. We pretend that childbirth is private. In Margaret's century, it was domestic, which is not the same thing. the space around a laboring woman filled with women midwives, whose skill was muscle memory maids, whose hands moved before thought a priest nearby if death wanted a door in. Physicians were rare in such rooms. Learned men liked to quote Galen and kept their distance from blood. The decision to attempt what the midwives attempted, that dangerous practiced merciful violence by which a child malpositioned might still be turned toward the world, was made by women because men did not have to make it. When Henry Tudor cried out, the room came briefly unstuck from the fear it had been glued to for a day. When the infant was moved to the hearth, and the mother's body lay quiet except for the shivering, the women began the second half of the work, saving what could be saved of the girl. After there would be fevers. There would be the slow bleed of strength that scared attendants more than the rush of the birth had, because endurance runs out in silence. There would be prayers Margaret stitched to herself like bandages, hours in a chapel, the Book of Hours, that became more hers than any jewel, the small acts of will by which a person who has been acted upon begins again to act. There would be a quiet vow spoken to God or to herself that her body would not be asked to walk that road again. She never bore another child. People who preferred a tidy moral said God had required a price for giving England a king and had taken it in her fertility. People who were kinder said nothing at all. We must be sober about consent because the word wears a different coat here. Did she assent to the marriage? Likely. She nodded when told and repeated what the priest required, I will, with the composure she had been trained to show. Did she agree to the timing and the manner by which that marriage would be made flesh? In a world where a girl is property, the Crown can grant her opinions were never documents anyone needed to read. Consent in canon law could be uttered by a child. Consent in flesh was taken as implied by uttered words. That is the distance Margaret's life had to cross, and cross it she did not by argument but by survival and the uses of survival. From the vantage of the great ark we know where this cruel efficiency leads: a winter birth in a castle where sea wind harps in the joints of stones. A boy named for a saint and a dynasty not yet imagined. An uncle who will be both guardian and general. A mother who will turn the memory of that bed into a kind of sword tempered by prayer, wielded in letters, held steady by patience. The Tudor story does not begin in triumph. It begins as so many stories in that century begin, with paper advantage and a body asked to pay the balance due. War does not always arrive with banners. Sometimes it announces itself as shortages and new faces at old gates, as gossip tightening into certainty, as the sound of hooves at night. In southwest Wales during 1456 it came in all these ways at once. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was doing the king's business, Henry VI kind, patient business, shoring up Lancastrian loyalties in a marchland where loyalty ran along family hedges and old grudges. The House of York had learned the marches too, and was quick to arm the men who could turn local quarrels into a campaign. A Yorkist captain seized Carmarthen Castle in late summer, and Edmund, riding hard to answer that insult, was taken in turn. He went behind those walls alive and came out only as news. Prison eats a man's strength the way the sea eats rock, slowly, with a rhythm you cannot bargain with. Edmund sickened the official letters, said a fever sweeping through the garrison and the town alike. Plague was a word people disliked, but it explained so many deaths that autumn it became almost a politeness. Those inclined to suspicion called it convenience that a favourite of the king's should die so quickly and leave no marks anyone wished to display. The garrison's commander swore he had offered such care as a prisoner might expect. Those who had lost too much already spat the retort back: a prisoner expects nothing. The exact manner matters less than its timing. November 1456, with winter just beginning, and a girl at Bletsoe, carrying a child who would never meet his father. Jasper Tudor learned first. He always seemed to learn first and moved at once. He knew what such a death meant in a world that made symbols of the living and opportunities of the dead. A pregnant widow with Beaufort blood and a Tudor heir inside her body was a prize York would seize if they could, and a responsibility Lancaster must guard if it could still call itself a house. Jasper gathered men, horses, and papers that would smooth the passage of a noble girl through dangerous counties, then took the road toward Bedfordshire. When he came to Bletsoe, the conversation was short. Margaret did not need to be told the larger meanings. She had been taught all her life to hear the sentence behind the sentence. They left before the weather could think of a reason to hold them. The journey was a geometry of discomfort. The litter creaked. The ruts were iron, hard under a skin of ice. Wind found its way into everything and made a meal of warmth. Jasper rode alongside when the roads allowed, and scouted ahead when they did not. Letters went before them like sparrows alighting at houses where a fire would be banked and a guard discreet. Margaret rested as the day permitted, and as her body insisted. Each jolt carried hot pain into her spine. The baby turned and turned again, as if impatient with the world's slowness. They crossed rivers whose names were prayers to safe crossings. They climbed ridges that showed the sea as a hard, dark band at the edge of everything like ink, drawn by a ruler. Men with nothing to declare but their loyalties watched them from hedgerows. Some made to follow and thought better of it when they counted the lances Jasper had gathered. It took 5 days to do what good weather might have allowed in 3. They arrived at Pembroke less because the way was open than because Jasper's will made it so. Pembroke is a fortress that answers questions before you ask them. The great round keep rises from a rock that looks as if it has decided to be a castle whether or not men oblige it. The walls run like a coastline, finding natural edges and making others. Beneath the keep is a cavern, Wogan Cavern, where the tide reaches in and out as if the sea and the fortress share a secret. From the ramparts you can see Milford Haven glittering with winter light when there is any, and when there is none you see only the black shape of a harbour that can bring salvation or trouble with equal ease. Jasper's household was a soldier's household, ordered, spare, efficient. Within hours of arrival, Margaret had a chamber prepared against draughts as far as stone and hangings will permit, with a brazier that never quite won its war against the cold. The women who would tend her came in quietly, felt with experienced hands what ached where, and began at once the work of easing a body that had been asked to endure too much on the road and would soon be asked to endure more. The midwives knew before the physician dared say it aloud. The girl was narrow in the hips, and the child heavy in the belly, a combination that turned the ordinary danger of birth into something that must be managed like a siege. They took stock linen in stacks, boiled water in plenty, herbs dried to a crisp and ready for steeping a birthing stool at hand cord, and swaddling knives sharp for the uses that admit no euphemism. They fetched a relic, a strip of parchment with a prayer to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, rolled and tied to make a birth girdle, and they bound it lightly around the young mother's waist, not because magic works, but because courage sometimes does. They arranged the room's light so that shadows fell where it was kindness, and did not fall where it would be unkind. The priest remained close in the chapel, his Latin a steady tide against fear's noisy little waves. Labour began on a day that had never warmed the kind of January that makes even fire seem theoretical. It started as a pinch and tightened to a fist. The older midwife watched Margaret's face more than the clock. Time in such rooms is kept by other instruments, the tempo of breath, the flare of the nostrils, the beginnings and ends of groans. They tried walking early, slowly hand to hand around the chamber to persuade the child downward. They tried rest when the walking made her shake with exhaustion. They coaxed and pressed, turned her onto a side, then another. A physician came once, spoke briefly, and left with the look of a man who knows his books have little to say to blood. The women consulted among themselves, in a whispering shorthand, the verbal counterpart to muscle memory. Margaret's body, small and stubborn, fought as if survival were a skill it had learned in another context, and was now applying here. The pains stacked like storm waves. Her mouth dried, then flooded with saliva, then dried again until a maid touched a cloth to her lips between contractions. She did not cry out at first, and when she did it was the helpless sound of a person who has been polite for longer than she should. The midwives encouraged the screams. Sound is a kind of breath, and breath is the horse that draws the cart of pain. The hours arranged themselves around the bed. Outside, the wind wrote its own script on the arrow slits. Inside, the candles wrote a smaller one. Jasper walked to the door and away from it and back again so often that the flagstones learned his pace. At a point beyond clocks, when the older midwife's hands had ceased to be hands and become instruments, she made her decision. No knives. No unholy hopes like a living mother's caesarean, which in that century is a rumour, or a last sacrament, not a procedure. Only the dangerous intimacy of practised fingers and the art of turning a life by touch. She spoke to Margaret, not as to a patient, but as to an accomplice. This will hurt. Breathe when I tell you. You must hold still when everything in you wants to run. Margaret did it. You would not be wrong to call it bravery. You would also not be wrong to call it obedience learned by a lifetime of listening when women gave instructions meant to save you. When the child came at last, he came with the exhausted indignation of babies everywhere, startled to find that the world has edges and that air stings. He protested. The room answered with grins that looked almost delirious, and then with the quiet efficiency that returns after triumph. They cleared his mouth. They wrapped him tight. They laid him on his mother's chest long enough to baptize the moment with touch and warmth. Henry, someone said, because one must say a name to make a story begin. He was small only in the way that all newborns are small. To a woman who had been afraid of a giant, he seemed perfect. The victory did not end the battle. Blood had been asked for and had been given without measure. The tearing was bad, the trembling worse. Fever lurked like a wolf at the tree line. The midwives set about stitching with linen thread and prayer. They mixed warm wine with herbs to dull the serrated edge of afterpain. They moved the girl, gently pillowing her so that nothing pulled that should not. A physician stood in the doorway again, said something about humours that no one in the room needed to hear, and nodded when the older woman told him plainly what would be done. Jasper saw the child swaddled and set by the hearth, and let his shoulders drop a fraction the first time in days. He sent a rider with letters, one to court, one to a cousin who would post the news discreetly along the way, one to a man in Bristol who could be trusted to take a message where enemies might listen and hear only ordinary trade. He stood after in the chapel and gave thanks in the quiet way of men who do not like to talk about faith and find themselves using it. In his mind, the map of Wales was already bright with loyalties that needed tightening and shadows that needed thinning. The boy sleeping by the fire was not only Jasper's nephew now, not only Margaret's salvation and wound, he was a banner that must never be left unwatched. For Margaret, consciousness came and went like light through ragged cloud. She reached for the child when hands guided him to her. She watched the small features arrange themselves into a face she could memorize against 1,000 years of fear. Even now, somewhere inside that half-dream, she did arithmetic. She would never write down what safety costs, how patience pays, how to turn surviving into leverage, but those are thoughts for later. In this hour, the only thought that mattered was this. He lived. She lived. And the wind striking the stones of Pembroke sounded a little like applause. In the first days after the birth, triumph narrowed to tasks, warming stones wrapped in cloth, changing linens that seemed to bleed as fast as they could be boiled, lifting the girl only when absolutely necessary and never without 3 pairs of hands. The infant slept by the fire in a cradle hastily padded with fur. When he woke, he shouted at the cold as if insulted by it, and a maid laughed softly because indignation in someone so new is a kind of blessing. The mother did not laugh. She watched. And when they placed him to her breast, she tried, and sometimes the trying was enough, and sometimes her body, newly torn and frightened, refused its own instructions. The midwives spoke little of heroism and much of practicalities. There were stitches, the kind that tug at a person's patience every time she shifts. There was wine mulled with herbs to blunt the serrated edge of afterpains. There were poultices for fever, and the flick of a hand to dismiss a physician's muttered lecture on humours, when he could contribute nothing but vocabulary. The older woman set the room's tempo, quiet, constant, refusing panic. And in that tempo, Margaret learned the new arithmetic of her body, what movements cost, how much rest could be purchased for a few hours by enduring a few minutes, where pain sat and how it travelled. Fevers came and went like wolves at the tree line. On some afternoons, the girl seemed composed pulse, steady colour, faint but honest. By nightfall, her skin burned and her lips cracked, and attendants traded places to keep watch with spoons and damp cloths while the chaplain counted prayers in the chapel. There was a moment, a small bleak hour between midnight and dawn, when one of the women fetched a candle from the chest where the good ones were kept, the ones saved for dying. She did not light it, she set it within reach. The act was not superstition so much as readiness. It sat there until morning and was put quietly away. In the slow clearance of fever, a different difficulty showed itself, the kind for which there is no mixture to hand and no relic to bind around a waist. Margaret startled when anyone touched her without warning. Hands that only meant to lift a cup made her flinch. The softest voice could become in an instant a command her bones remembered too well. When they set the baby in her arms, she held him as if memorizing him were a task. She could complete eyes open, breath shallow, every feature counted and named to herself, then asked for him to be settled back into the cradle with a politeness that hurt the women more than an outcry would have done. This was not rejection, it was memory, rearranging the room into something she could stand to inhabit. In time, the rhythms steadied. The cradle's complaints found their place between psalms. The girl learned again to sit up without shaking. She ate with modest appetite, which in this house was cause for a small celebration. A message went to the parish priest, that the purification would be observed when the season and her strength allowed. Churching 40 days after birth when possible was both blessing and boundary, a rite that welcomed a woman back to public devotions, and beneath the liturgy whispered that the dangerous work of bringing life into the world had been seen and marked. For a girl who wore her piety like a bracer, that ceremony would matter. It would be a way to step from a bed that had nearly been her last place into a chapel that could be her first again. The wound that did not heal was the simplest to name and the hardest to prove. She would bear no more children. People spoke of it as if God and nature and politics had entered into a bargain. England could have this boy. The mother would be spared every future danger by never facing it again. That tidy moral did not interest the women who had watched her bleed. They preferred silence. We at our distance can say only what the record allows. Margaret Beaufort married twice more and conceived no other child. Whether age, anatomy, injury, or decision governed that outcome is not a question the century would answer for us. What we can see clearly is the way the knowledge shaped her chastity hardened over years from circumstance to principle. Self-command became both vocation and shield. Her piety, always present, turned into structure. Days that had previously been divided by household obligations and the occasional feast were now laced with offices, matins, and lords in the grey light. If she woke early prime, when the castle stirred the little hours as the infant slept and woke and slept again, vespers like a long exhale, compline at last with a hand on the cradle. Books helped. Someone, perhaps Jasper, perhaps a chaplain grateful for a patron in the making, found her a well-used book of hours in Latin with English rubrics, the kind that can survive tears and travel both. She read the Passion as if it were instructions for how to bind suffering to meaning. She read saints' lives and measured herself against women who had made vows in places hotter and quieter than Pembroke. Agnes, who refused a marriage. Catherine, who argued with philosophers. Margaret of Antioch, whose legend promised that dragons could be outlasted. She was not a mystic. She was an organizer of her own soul. And beyond the visible devotions, a different schooling resumed. The castle was a classroom if you knew where to sit. Jasper's household ran like a well-kept ledger. Men in his affinity came and went, with news favours sought and granted, grievances aired and soothed. Margaret listened. Estate officers reported rents in coin and in kind. She asked questions soft enough to sound like curiosity and sharp enough to be remembered later as competence. Letters arrived with wax still warm. She took them in her hands, read aloud without stumbling over the names of men who mattered, and drafted replies in a hand that was already precise and unadorned. If you want to see how a queen's mother is made, do not look only at altars. Watch how a woman learns to hear what a steward is not saying. Motherhood, this peculiar displaced version of it, became another discipline. Henry lay more often in others' arms than in hers at first, and that fact carved a scar they both would carry into better days. Yet she made of it something other than loss. She learned the schedules of his care and kept them as law. She asked for reports as if he were already a small lord who must make his progress through the duties of infancy. She chose his nurses with a caution that would have done credit to a quartermaster, and swapped one when the child's colour displeased her. She took him to the chapel and taught him without words how a person moves in a holy place, with attention, with humility, with the certainty that kneeling is not the same as surrendering. Word travelled, as it always does, that the Earl of Pembroke's sister-in-law had survived and that the child lived. The great houses listened and made their own calculations. The Yorkists heard a seed that must be kept from sun. The Lancastrians heard an heir whose name could steady men's hands when pay was late and hope was later. For a while, long enough for a routine to settle, the war seemed to breathe elsewhere. Margaret took the reprieve and turned it into a plan. She would strengthen first, then move as prudence required, and when she was required to give up the child to the guardianship that would harden him for his narrow future, she would do it, without collapsing. Knowledge was a brace, prayer the binding. We are tempted from our comfort to make of this convalescence a chapter with a moral suffering transmuted into sanctity, pain into steel. The truth is less tidy and more impressive. A teenager crawled back from the edge, on which other women had fallen, piecing herself together not once but many times a day. She permitted help and learned to direct it. She put her faith where it could hold rather than where it could only shout. And when her strength returned sufficiently for her to stand at last before the chapel's altar to be churched, her face wore not triumph but attention, the look of someone who has heard how thin the membrane is between two worlds and intends to walk closer to the side with light. Soon enough life would require her to be practical again, so practical that history would confuse it for calculation and call it cold. That is later. For now, a mother warming her hands before taking up her son, a woman lifting her gaze from a book to ask a steward to repeat the last figure, a candle lit in thanks not for a crown that no one could yet imagine, but for the simple, unkingly mercy of being allowed to go on. Safety sometimes arrives wearing the clothes of compromise. In the first months after Henry's birth, with fever receding and strength trickling back like thaw water, a new parchment came with a seal that mattered a marriage for Margaret Beaufort to Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. It promised nothing so grand as happiness. What it offered was a roof that could not easily be pulled down, a man whose surname opened doors even when politics changed their locks, and a household that could keep the child's inheritance from leaking away while the realm decided who it wanted for a king. The wedding in 1458 was a quiet thing, as quiet as two great names can be when joined. No river of courtiers, no pageant of trumpeters, a chapel, a priest, and witnesses with good memories. Margaret, 15 now, and thinner than fashion, stood steady in a gown that had been made to look less like a celebration and more like a statement: sobriety, dignity, the absence of fortune's noise. Sir Henry was not a romantic figure, no gossip clung to him, which in those years was a virtue. He had the bearing of a man bred to offices rather than adventures, the measured speech of someone who has watched more councils than battles. If he had private sympathies for the House of York, and there were murmurs that he did, he wore them like a small medal underclothing, present invisible, useful only when the weather changed. After the vows, the real marriage began, the one in the folios. The contract was careful as a chess player's hands. Margaret retained control of the Beaufort estates, those acres and rights that were her birth's hard dowry, protected by feoffees, to use as that late medieval sleight of hand by which land was placed in trusted keepers' names to keep it out of other men's appetites. Her jointure was set in clauses that would not collapse if a crown did. Sir Henry undertook the obvious duties: protection, maintenance, the show of strength that keeps trouble from testing a door, and the subtler ones: not prying the Beaufort holdings from Beaufort fingers, not insisting on custody of the boy whose life was already a public argument. On that point, the child Jasper Tudor's guardianship held. Henry slept in Wales under a roof Jasper had sworn to defend, and Margaret, who had carried him past death's elbow, learned to mother him with distance as discipline. If the ceremony had been modest, the household that received her was not poor. The Staffords' reach ran through the Midlands and into the court where favours were minted. Their halls were managed by men who could read a king's mood in the spacing of orders, and a sheriff's honesty in the spacing of figures. Margaret fit into this machinery with ease born of necessity. She brought with her a ledger habit, acquired at Pembroke, names aligned beneath sums, rents marked in coin and kind, arrears annotated with excusable reasons and inexcusable ones. She asked to see the year's view rather than the month's. She learned which tenants could not pay because the harvest had broken, and which would not pay because custom had softened into indiscipline. She spoke gently and was obeyed, which is the finest economy a great house can practice. Piety kept its place as structure, not display. Margaret's dawns began with matins, if her health allowed, or with the nearest office her strength could carry. A small oratory set aside for her use gathered beeswax penitential psalms, and the unmistakable atmosphere of someone who prayed as if work depended upon it. She endowed obits for the dead who had made her, the father whose failure shadowed her inheritance, the husband whose ambition had given her a son and a wound, and a weekly distribution of alms that put bread into hands that did not know or care what a Beaufort was. She did not confuse philanthropy with safety, but she knew it could smooth a road or quiet a rumour. Life steadied to the rhythm of administration. She sat with the steward over corrodies and liveries, over the seasonal purchase of salt fish and the annual repair of roofs the wind insisted upon owning. She read correspondence from lawyers who preferred Latin's cushion to English's edge, and sent back instructions in a hand so legible it served as a kind of authority. Sir Henry, watching, recognized in his young wife something men of his house prized competence that did not ask to be praised. He came to trust her accounts because they balanced, and her judgments because they were rarely theatrical. When he rode to attend the Duke, his father, or to show his face at court where attendance is a form of insurance, she could keep the household not merely upright, but pointed towards solvency. There was kindness between them, not the first bloom of it, but the sort that grows well in partial shade. Sir Henry possessed the courteous restraint of a man raised among more important people. He made space rather than demands. He did not quarrel with the crucifix that marked every room she claimed, nor with the priest who became her confessor and counselor. If he sometimes weighed his words about the king, which king he did so with an eye to the future safety of the house rather than to score victories in a marriage that had been made for larger reasons. He understood that his wife's son by another man was also, if the stars shifted, his own best insurance against an age that punished the wrong loyalty with ruin. News ran between them like a second household. From Wales, Jasper's messengers brought thin letters about a boy's growth measured in inches, and new words about the health of the Marcher lordships that framed his safety about the weather on roads armies might soon need. Margaret held those pages as if warmth might cross the fibres. She kept them in a small box with a clasp that clicked like a lock on worry. Sometimes, when the distance yawned too wide, she wrote back as mothers do, little lists of admonitions disguised as love gifts folded in that taught a lesson, a prayer book with marginalia in her hand, a small knife with a well-made sheath, and a lecture about tools kept keen. More often she wrote as a stateswoman in training, thanking a captain who had sheltered Jasper's men in bad weather, recommending a chaplain who could be trusted to teach Latin without teaching treachery. The realm beyond the Stafford halls did not rest. It rarely does. York and Lancaster glanced at one another from behind petitions and livery badges, and the Royal Council's minutes became a palimpsest of crises managed and deferred. Sir Henry kept one eye on the court where Edward's partisans whispered, and another on the county where sheriffs' musters told truths posters did not. He did not force his wife to recant her blood. She did not force him to pretend he had none of his own. They met at the point adults meet when the weather is bad. What must be done today to preserve tomorrow's options? There were days when Margaret's body reminded her what it had paid. Riding distances left her grey and silent. Winter tightened old injuries into knots that prayer could ease but not untie. She learned to delegate the journeys. A good lady of the house once would have taken herself to send a trusted officer to audit a manor's accounts or to settle a quarrel among tenants over a boundary hedge. The trust ran both directions. Men who had not sought instruction from a teenage girl discovered they preferred accuracy to vanity. Women who had seen her in childbirth now saw her in chair and chapel, setting a rule that did not crack when tested. If authority is partly performance, she chose a role that fit the plot, not the lady of bright festivals, but the one whose presence quieted a room and whose absence made sums go wrong. It is easy to say that this second marriage was a business partnership, and not wrong. But business in that century was not merely profit, it was survival arranged in columns. In Sir Henry's house, Margaret found a ledger large enough to write herself into the future. In Margaret's competence, Sir Henry found a margin of safety he could not have purchased elsewhere. Between them they made a life measured in small victories, a rent paid without quibble, a scribe who learned her preferences and copied swiftly, a winter with enough salted meat to see the household through without borrowing. These are not the acts for which chroniclers dip their pens, but they are the scaffolding upon which chronicles hang. And underneath the tame surface something sharper grew. Margaret's letters multiplied. Her network of women cousins by marriage and by temperament thickened into a web through which news moved faster than banners. She practiced the art of knowing who owed whom, and for what and how a favour called small at the time could be called great later without anyone losing face. She learned when to be seen and when to be reported as having been seen. When the wars came closer again as they would, she would have more than prayer and courage to set against them. She would have a working knowledge of how power travels. For now, picture her at a table with accounts and a candle, a rosary looped around the wrist that holds the pen. Sir Henry's measured footfall in a corridor, a steward waiting to be told where to send barley and where to send men. Picture, too, a sealed letter in a courier's pouch bound for Pembroke, where a boy with a serious mouth is learning to laugh at a falconer's jokes, and to stand still for lessons he will someday be grateful to have learned. Between those two images, the mother in her order, and the son in his refuge, stretches the narrow bridge of years that will decide a kingdom. They are crossing it now step by deliberate step. The kingdom's first true shudder came in 1455, and it did not begin with trumpets. It began with letters that would not settle with retainers, wearing one badge to dinner and another to ride home with sheriffs who practiced impartiality the way nervous men practice a smile. Then armoured men came to St. Albans on a May morning and argued with poleaxes. It was a brief fight that looked to those watching from upper windows like a quarrel between cousins gone too far. In reality, it was a gate, and once the realm walked through it, there was no going back to petitions and carefully phrased grievances. Richard, Duke of York, forced his way to the king. Henry VI bled a little and conceded a lot, and England discovered that settling arguments by statute is a habit, not a law of nature. Margaret Beaufort, newly a wife again, and finding her footing in the Stafford household, learned the news as gentry learn everything twice. First in a tidy report trimmed of panic and full of nouns, and then in the murmurs of men who had seen too much steel that week. Her husband's kin tilted York out of calculation as much as conviction. Edward, Earl of March, York's son, was 6 foot of unignorable certainty, and certainty is a commodity when the world grows loud. Margaret tilted Lancaster by blood and by the memory of a winter birth, sheltered by Jasper Tudor. Marriage made a bridge between 2 hilltops, and she learned to walk it without looking down the way cautious people cross frozen rivers. Step, listen, step. The years that followed had a drumbeat. Wakefield, December 1460. York rode out underwhelmed by intelligence and paid for it with his life, his second son Edmund with him, their heads spiked over Micklegate Bar like punctuation marks that shout. Mortimer's Cross, February 1461. Edward, now leader of the Yorkist cause, met Jasper Tudor in a clash that was half battle and half loud announcement. The winter morning had shown a rare pale ring around the sun. 3 sons, men swore an omen the Yorkists adopted at once, and the Lancastrians could not talk away. Owen Tudor, Jasper's father, was taken after the rout and beheaded at Hereford. Someone tied his head to the market cross. Someone else, less theatrical, whispered a prayer. English history is made of such simultaneities. 2 weeks later, the Second Battle of St. Albans. Queen Margaret of Anjou, tired of being history's grievance and eager to be its actor, struck hard and clean, recovered her husband from Yorkist hands, and watched the realm's eyebrows climb toward its hairline. For a moment, the Lancastrian cause looked like a ship catching a new wind. Then it lost it again. Edward marched on London, the city opened its gates, and the fresh young certainty let the crown sit upon his shoulders before the law had finished asking its questions. The question would be settled elsewhere in the north on a different kind of day. Towton, Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461, was winter pretending to be spring and being found out. Men fought in a snowstorm, snow blowing needle-sharp into faces, turning banners into sodden burdens, and blood into thin paint. Numbers are treacherous in the 15th century and grow in the telling. What is not treacherous is this: more Englishmen died there in a single day than anyone could remember, and the survivors remembered for the rest of their lives. The field became a sawmill that fed on hope. Edward's archers used the wind the way sailors do, sending volleys farther than the Lancastrians expected. When the lines broke, they broke all at once, and the rout down the narrow crossing of Cockbeck turned the river into a register of the dead. Towton did not end the war. It ended the illusion that the war was a disagreement. Margaret measured the battle by what changed in the days after. Yorkists rode with a new insolence. Lancastrians wrote fewer letters and folded them tighter. In London, Edward IV sat easier in a chair built for a man with broad shoulders and a taste for victory's immediacy. The noon sun on St. Paul's threw new shadows. In the Midlands, Sir Henry Stafford made the sort of visits reliable men make in unreliable times. He showed his face where it needed showing, spoke warmly of order, and brought home the sense of a realm rearranging itself without quite admitting the rearrangement. In Wales, Jasper closed his hand more tightly around Pembroke. He had lost a father and kept a nephew, and he understood which fact the century would reward. Henry the child grew in increments of inches and verbs. He learned to point to name, to laugh at dogs, to quiet when the chapel required quiet. Letters told Margaret such things because men who could not write of strategy to a young mother wrote of what they could write: teeth fevers, the new trick of standing with one hand on a bench and the other waving to a nurse as if he were already acknowledging a crowd. She read those lines until the ink seemed to thin under her eyes. She read too what lay between them: that Jasper's castle was provisioned with care, that musters in certain lordships had been brisk, that a captain of doubtful loyalty had been replaced without offence. Motherhood here was the art of reading statecraft as gossip and gossip as statecraft. She built a small intelligence out of ordinary materials. Monastic houses lay like beads on the string of the roads. A lay brother who sold cheese at market could carry a rumour more cheaply than a courier carried a writ. Merchants moved cloth and information with equal discretion. A Flemish factor in Coventry saw things a sheriff did not. A literate groom in a rival stable, a fishmonger with cousins near Carmarthen, a chantry priest who heard what men said when candles burned low. These were her weather vanes. She did not ask them to spy, she asked them to notice. They answered not because she paid lavishly, she did not, nor because she promised a future she knew better, but because she listened as if their noticing gave shape to the world. That kind of attention is its own currency. At home she played a quieter game, how to be Lancastrian in her marrow, and tolerable at a Yorkist-leaning table. It required the discipline of adjectives. She praised order, not Edward, peace, not victory. She spoke warmly of mercy when talk turned to attainders, the legal erasures by which a man's estates vanished into the crown's hand, reminding those within earshot that children did not choose their fathers. When Sir Henry talked politics, she slid the conversation to logistics. If the king required levies, what grain must be bought to feed them? If the sheriff called a muster, what harness must be repaired? Such questions are loyalty in a lower key, the key in which houses survive. Sir Henry, for his part, navigated the crosswind with the caution of a man who has watched great trees fall. He rode when called, bled when required. Edgecote later would be his bitter lesson, and kept his name clear of the more theatrical plots. He did not try to bleach his wife's blood. He did not force her into pageants she could not in conscience applaud. There was a compact here, no clerk enrolled. He would be the visible loyalty that calmed neighbours. She would be the invisible steadiness that kept their house from running aground. Between them, Henry the child had two shields, one with a rose, the colour of his mother's lineage, one with the practical colour of timber and bread. Towton's long shadow cooled the realm. The Lancastrian cause did not vanish. It stiffened into corners and waited. Margaret understood the waiting almost as a gift. Waiting is a craft if you practice it. She used the time to drill her household in habits that look like piety and are in crisis strategy accounts that can be produced without embarrassment, stores that can be counted without lying, servants who know what not to say when questioned by men who do not have the right to ask. She trained her hand to write swiftly and small letters that could ride in a dame's sewing bag or slip inside a pilgrim's palm leaf badge. She practiced erasing herself from scenes where presents would be added to the wrong column, and yet this was not a frozen life. There were feast days with music. There were small markets where colours returned to faces that had been pale all winter. There were babies born to tenants whose names Margaret knew from the same lists as their rents. She sponsored a marriage, stood godmother to a girl whose mother had nursed Henry, sent for a limner to repair a cracked panel of St. Michael that had watched over the hall before anyone alive could remember. Such gestures are the opposite of war. They are how people remember what peace feels like, so they can recognize it if it ever comes back. From the vantage of the decade, we know what Towton accomplished. It pinned Edward IV to the throne long enough for him to begin inventing himself as a king, lavish, magnetic, as attentive to silk as to steel. We know too what it accomplished for a young woman in the Midlands. It made her household more valuable to both sides. Yorkists saw in Margaret Stafford a Lancastrian who could be placated by mercy and contained by comfort. Lancastrians saw in her a bridge they might need if they were ever to return with honour. She let both readings stand, and gave neither the satisfaction of being wholly right. At night sometimes, when letters slept and servants ceased their purposeful movements, and Sir Henry's breath evened in the next chamber, Margaret stood before a small window that looked over nothing in particular, and practised the one skill that would keep her alive when the wind changed again. She pictured the map of England and moved her point of view across it. Pembroke's walls, London's courts, York's towers, monasteries with their lead roofs, bright in rain harbours with masts like forests. She placed her son among these images like a chess piece that must not be exchanged. And when her mind reached the field, she did not wish to see the snow-stung one. She let it pass, and thought instead of a child's hand patting a dog into stillness. With practice, a person can teach the heart which scenes it may revisit, and which it must only record. The drums would sound again. Wakefield had taught us what happens when one victory imagines itself irrefutable. But for a little while after Towton, the realm wore a fixed expression, and the households within it learned to breathe in that mask. In those rooms, Margaret Beaufort perfected the art she would later be praised and blamed for, in equal measure the conversion of survival into patience, patience into influence, and influence into a plan for a future no one else could safely speak aloud. The first crack in Edward IV's bright certainty did not appear on a battlefield. It showed in a seating plan. In the summer of 1464, the young king married in secret to Elizabeth Woodville, beautiful, fertile, inconvenient, and when he paraded her family into power, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who had set Edward on his chair, found himself edged away from the table he believed he had laid. The Woodvilles multiplied like ivy around the trunk of royal favour marriages, wardships offices that open purses and bind clients. Men noticed. Men always notice when other men's cousins are promoted over their own. Warwick's smile hardened. His affinity northern proud, used to being the channel through which patronage flowed, began to murmur. By 1469 that murmur had become a weather system. Rebellions flickered in the north. Under a useful fiction, Robin of Redesdale and Warwick fanned them with both hands. The Duke of Clarence, Edward's brother, lend-leased his discontent to his father-in-law Warwick by marrying Warwick's daughter Isabel against the king's explicit wishes. In July, William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, the Yorkist who had muscled Jasper Tudor out of South Wales, marched to smack the rebels down and met them instead at Edgecote Moor, where Warwick's captains unstitched his army and Warwick's men unstitched Herbert himself on a Northampton scaffold a day later. Edward IV, taken into his kingmaker's keeping, discovered how narrow a throne can feel when someone else holds the stairs. From the Stafford halls this did not look like justice, and it did not look like treason. It looked like risk becoming policy. Margaret watched as Sir Henry rode where cautious loyalty required musters counsels, the visible acts that reassure neighbours, and came home with stories that rested on economics more than honour. The currency of loyalty was never simply love of crown. It was annuities that arrived when promised sheriffdoms that came with the right fees, wardships that turned into marriages for your son's retainers, wearing your badge, because you could afford the livery and the lawsuits that followed them. Edward's quick temper and quicker affections had spent too many promises on one affinity. Warwick's sulks cost the realm more than silk ever did. Between the two, good gentry found themselves paying and paying again. Margaret did not argue politics at the high volume men prefer. She practiced a subtler persuasion, shaping what Sir Henry already half believed and giving it form. Over accounts she asked apparently innocent questions. Had so-and-so's annuity come this quarter? Had the sheriff's writs been honoured, or did the Woodvilles' friends plead exemption? Which of Warwick's men held the roads, and how did that affect the price of moving barley? She let him say the conclusion out loud that the realm was being run as a family quarrel, and that families do not pay their bills on time. When he called Edward generous but careless, she allowed the compliment to stand while she folded the critique into it. When he praised Warwick's competence and flinched at his ruthlessness, she agreed softly that men who think they make kings forget that subjects cannot live forever in the rehearsal for a coup. Do not imagine sermons. She poured wine and laid figures before him, and told him stories brought by her web of women, quiet dispatches from households where Woodville cousins now sat in the best chairs, and where Warwick's northern men arrived with a list of reforms that sounded like replacements. She made a practice of noticing wounded pride in other men and showing Sir Henry what wounded pride does when armed. He who had been overlooked once or twice by courtiers who collected favours like relics did not need much translation. Edgecote did what such battles do to men who serve for order instead of glory. It taught Sir Henry that the king's peace could be punctured, and that when it was those who bled for mending it might not be thanked. He was not at that fight. The cut that would finally undo him would come later at Barnet in 1471 and fester into his October death. But Edgecote cracked his faith in the regime's competence, which is sometimes a mortal wound by slower means. When Edward was released, and Warwick, unable to govern with the king in his pocket, retreated to the only policy he had left, Margaret watched the pieces rearrange Warlord newly estranged brother-in-law, a negotiation with the Lancastrian queen he had hunted for years. Strange bedfellows abound when the floor keeps moving. In the months between Edgecote and that unholy alliance, Margaret's marriage turned into a wardroom. She tended the practical shames of a realm misgoverned, arrears owed to their men, suits delayed because judges were working out whose cousin had seniority, the small corruptions that are not crimes and still sour a county. She kept Sir Henry's bitterness from becoming recklessness by giving it work. If they will not pay, she said when wages lagged for the sheriff's muster, we will feed our own. She counted harness-repaired straps, made a note which man's horse needed shoeing. It is hard to leap into someone else's war when your wife is handing you a list of things that might still be mended at home. But she did not confuse housekeeping with history. The correspondences multiplied, and with them the tone of her counsel sharpened. Edward had alienated his greatest subject. Warwick had mistaken leverage for right. Between them yawned an opportunity and a danger. If Lancastrian fortunes lifted even a little, Her son's distant claim would brighten from academic to actionable, and with that brightness would come arrows. She began quietly to reweave threads of acquaintance with women who could hear both sides without being accused of hearing either a Woodville cousin who shared her taste for salters and straight talk, a Neville widow who preferred stability to revenge, a prioress with two noble sisters in opposing camps, and a gift for keeping sisters speaking. Through such mouths moved the kind of talk that does not reach chroniclers. If the world flips, whom must we protect first? If the king forgives, whom must he forgive loudly? Meanwhile, Warwick found the limit of sulking. He fled in 1470 the king in pursuit, and washed up on a French shore where Queen Margaret of Anjou was also nursing the wreckage of her cause. Necessity introduced them. He offered the army he could still raise. She offered the legitimacy he could not manufacture. Clarence, ever useful to enemies, went with his father-in-law. The pact had the ugly taste of renounced principles, but politics is made of acquired tastes. If you wanted a word that year you could write beside Lancaster and York, it was swap. Margaret watched the swap with a precision that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with timing. If Henry VI returned even for a season, it would not make her son a prince, but it would make him more than a rumour. Too visible too soon, and Edward would come back with a rope in his hand. Too hidden, and the chance would pass without her ever having touched it. She began the hard work that would define her life, balancing at the edge of possibility, moving weight from foot to foot without falling. Sir Henry's politics followed the strict line of survival. No foolish gestures. No riding to Warwick's banner because wounded pride wanted revenge on Woodville glitter. No grandstanding for Lancaster, because the boy in Wales was Lancastrian by blood. If the realm is going to throw the dice, he said, let us stand where the table will not be kicked over onto us. It was not cowardice. It was a husband's math estates, men the honour that keeps your tenants calling you my lord without irony. Margaret did not argue him out of it. She made sure that when the dice stopped rolling they would have a stake to play. In the quiet between alarms there is always such a quiet like the hush before a hawk stoops. She did what she always did, put structure under breath. She revised her fiefments, so that if a crown tried to strip her, it would find only layers of trustees and uses that would take months to unwind. She rehearsed with her servants what courtesies to offer to whose deputies if the badge at the door changed overnight. She counted silver and redistributed it into smaller hoards, some for the chapel, some for the buttery, some in a chest that could ride in a cart with the baby's cradle if flight were ever required again. A woman can turn a house into a defensible position without lifting a sword. Warwick would soon sail back with French ships and a policy stitched together from grievance and calculation. Edward would flee and then return with Burgundian gold and the kind of focus that only exile gives a man. Sir Henry would finally find his blood on the ground at Barnet and carry that wound toward October. Those are the headlines. The story behind them in a Midlands room is a woman bending the weather of a marriage without breaking it, teaching a good man to distrust bad governance, asking him to wait longer than patience feels possible, and preparing, always preparing, for the day when waiting would become action. The realm inhaled briefly as if a storm had passed. In October 1470, after a summer of defections and a French-brokered reconciliation, so awkward it squeaked Richard Neville Warwick, the kingmaker brought Henry VI out of the Tower and led him through London like a relic, returned. Bells spoke from every church. Pageant wagons rattled over stones. The city, polite as ever to whatever wore a crown, lined the streets with faces curious and careful. Henry looked thin and bewildered, the old gentleness in him showing like a lamp's flame through worn paper. Men who had sworn to Edward IV a month earlier swore to him now. Clerks wrote that the rightful line was restored. Priests wrote that God had remembered his promise to the meek. Merchants wrote that credit might at last outlive rumour. None of it was true and all of it necessary. Margaret Beaufort watched the readaptation as one watches a patient sit up in bed after a fever-hopeful alert to the undertow. Henry VI's second reign was less a government than a ritual. Real power ran in the channels Warwick and his Neville kin had dug with a decade of patronage. The law tried to keep pace attained as reversed, commissions reissued, sheriffs swapped like chess pieces, yet the ink never quite dried before the names changed again. Yorkist partisans were told to go home and be sensible. Some did because they were sensible. Others cleaned their harnesses to a shine and waited for the wind to turn. Clarence, that weather vane of a man, spun. Margaret counted him as a hazard, not an ally, because she had learned that men who defect by appetite defect again by habit. What did London feel like those months? Like a city that had found its manners and mislaid its memory. Guilds laid out their best cloth. The mayor processed with a dignity that suggested this had always been the plan. Sermons at Paul's Cross wrapped the miracle in tidy doctrine. But over ale and among apprentices, and in the corners of counting-houses, men spoke low of the king's vacant silences, of Warwick's pride, of French ships at anchor, as if waiting for a misstep. The Woodvilles, pushed out with a shove, took refuge where women do in houses that still needed managing. Elizabeth Woodville would give birth in sanctuary, that autumn veiled and courted by sympathy that could not be turned into soldiers. The city learned again the taste of provisional loyalty. Jasper Tudor, practical as always, used the pause. With Henry VI nominally king, his own authority in Wales could be asserted without apology. He tightened the guard around Pembroke, shuffled captains, removed a few who had learned corruption too quickly, kept a few who were corrupt in ways he could count. He sent Margaret letters that smelled of smoke and sea air. Your son is tall for his years. Your son speaks more Welsh than English when he is tired. Your son asks why men fold their banners at night. She read them aloud to Sir Henry, and later again to herself, one hand on the latch of the little chest where such papers lived. She knew this sort of reprieve. Like winter thaws, it promises mud, and breaks your heart if you mistake it for spring. Across the narrow sea, Edward IV was learning the lesson. Ambitious men only learn when stripped of their trappings, who still comes when there is nothing to hand out. In Burgundy he found coin. In the Low Countries he found ships. In his own unwavering confidence he found the last ingredient. He landed at Ravenspur in March 1471 with a small force and a large story. He had come only for his duchy, not the crown, heavens no, just to recover his private rights. Men smiled at the lie, because they wanted to. Clarence, true to form, decided that the wind now blew York and hurried to embrace his brother. The weather changed. It always does when coin, charisma, and a plausible march line up. Warwick moved to meet him at Barnet on Easter Sunday, the 14th of April, 1471. Fog lay thick over the field, the kind that turns formations into rumours and banners into ghosts. The kingmaker, who had spent years arranging other men's victories, found the instruments of his own failing him. Misalignment and misrecognition did as much killing as steel. The Neville's badge and Oxford's star were mistaken in the murk. Friendly archers shot into friendly backs. Cries of treason did what cries of treason always do, unstitched nerve faster than any arrow. When the light lifted enough for men to see what they had done, Warwick lay among the dead. He had made a king and unmade one, and could not finally keep his own feet on the ground he had cleared. The country took note. It remembers the deaths that end arguments. The city heard the news before it saw the proof. Then it saw the proof and belief that slow animal came loping after. Queen Margaret and her son Edward of Westminster had just come ashore at Weymouth with French support when Barnet's outcome caught them like a wave that rears up and drops all at once. There was no time for a new plan, only the old one gather. March hoped to join forces that could match Edward before he found them. They moved north, and west men added to their number who still believed Lancastrian meant possible. Edward, brisk and newly ruthless, moved faster. Tewkesbury, the 4th of May 1471, was sunlight after fog, and worse for it. The ground rose and fell in shallow folds, hedges and ditches, offering small advantages that mattered to men on foot and the horses they feared. The fight was decided in the brutal way such things are decided by one flank folding by the press, becoming panic by a handful of commanders holding their nerve a minute longer than their counterparts. When it ended, it did not end. The sanctuary at the Abbey could not hold back the world. Prince Edward, 17 and a head taller than despair, was cut down on the field, by some accounts in custody by others, and with him went the last simple claim of Lancaster to the throne. Simple because there were others, paper paths, and genealogies that could be drawn in tidy lines through John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford and their legitimised heirs. But the embodied claim, the one that could be shown to men as they drank and told they ought to follow, he was gone. Margaret felt the world tilt without moving from her chair. Letters arrived, stripped of ornament, Warwick dead, Barnet lost, the prince fallen, the queen taken. The habit of prayer steadied her. The habit of arithmetic resumed. Without Prince Edward, Henry VI was king in name and hostage in practice. Without Prince Edward, every Lancastrian with even a bookkeeper's claim to kinship could be called by his enemies a pretender and by his friends a hope. Without Prince Edward, the quiet boy in Pembroke became to the men who needed a banner, a banner. Safety and danger rose together like swallow and shadow. The last act of the readaptation played out at night. On the 21st of May 1471, Henry VI died in the Tower. The official line was melancholy and God's will. The unofficial line was a blade and the new king's will. Either way, the realm absorbed the fact and hurried on because hurrying was easier than thinking about the softness of the back of the skull. Chroniclers wrote with peculiar care. Those who loved words more than men saw the beauty in their own caution and hated themselves for it later. Margaret read only what mattered with Henry gone, and his son dead at Tewkesbury. There was no longer a Lancastrian prince to obstruct the imagination. Her son's name grew louder in other people's mouths. Jasper moved from prudence to necessity. He had guarded his nephew against hunger, against boredom, against the smaller cruelties of men who drink and command. Now he must guard him against attention. Men who had never spoken the boy's name before began to include it in their calculations, as if merely writing Henricus on a page were an act of resistance. The act could be read also as treason by those who wished to read it so. Yorkist men in Wales, Herbert's kin, others who had taken the king's peace and enjoyed the king's favour were alert. The march was no longer a refuge, it was a net. Margaret's letters leave no record of panic. Panic was not her manner, and in any case would have endangered more than her dignity. She wrote instead with a tone she had perfected, factual, devout, at the hinges, insistent without hysteria. She trusted Jasper to read the unsaid, "I will lose him if we keep him. I will lose him if we move him. I choose the loss that leaves him breathing." She sent gifts that were instructions, money that could be converted to silence on short notice, a purse sewn oddly so that anyone opening it in a hurry would spill coin and be noticed, a small brooch with a saint tucked into the filigree, because a boy who is about to lose his country should be reminded that he has not lost his mother. London, for its part, exhaled again, this time with the relieved vulgarity of men who bet on the winner. Edward IV walked his city a conqueror twice over his smile, returned to ease his hand heavy on the reins of mercy and punishment as needed. He rewarded, he punished, he married and unmarried estates by statute. He hung a few to make a point, he pardoned many to make a policy. The markets reopened to the kind of gossip that runs on silk and spices. The sermons recalibrated. The new old order reasserted itself like a back that has clicked into place. Those who had toasted Henry VI a season earlier learned to call their own hope pious error and their caution foresight. Thus are consciences mended in public. None of that mended what mattered to Margaret. A realm neatly knit by statute could still unravel around a single child if the wrong eye found him. She had never imagined her son a prince in the lazy way of mothers who make crowns out of first words. She had imagined him alive, and that ambition had grown so enormous inside her that it had made a shape of her life. The spring of 1471 taught her that to keep him alive she would have to let him go farther than she had feared. It is a difficult mathematics. You select the loss you can outlive. The decision to run belongs to Part 12, the storm, the harbour, the grey line of Brittany like a promise at the horizon. For now, stand with her at a table where a candle smokes and the wax has puddled into a coastline. She lays out the facts like tokens Barnet Tewkesbury Tower. She adds the only piece left to add Tenby. She does not weep. She presses her hand against a page until the paper takes the heat of it, as if warmth can be stored and sent. Then she writes the letter that says everything and asks nothing. God keep you. Do not delay. Trust your uncle. Remember your prayers. Remember me. The sea took them in a rush. September 1471, Tenby's little harbour, a dark comma on the Welsh coast, the sky full of hard intent. There was no ceremony, only bundles carried at a run, and orders spoken low enough not to echo. Jasper Tudor made decisions in the tempo of danger. This horse, not that. This boat, not the larger one men would notice. That wind unfavourable, and therefore honest. The boy who would become a king clambered aboard with a grace born of youth and training. He was 14 now, long-limbed, serious-mouthed, learned enough to know how little he knew, and he turned once to look back as if the shore might turn to a face he could remember. It did not. Tenby slid away a line smudged by rain. The oars bit the sail took, and then Wales was a thought and sea a fact. Storm is the oldest policeman on the water. It questioned them all night, throwing ropes of spray that stung the eyes and made prayer feel more practical than most equipment. The mast talked to itself in the wind. The planks breathed like frightened animals under the men's feet. Someone was sick and then everyone was sick. Jasper moved among them as if the deck were steady shouting when shouting was required and clasping a shoulder when that would do more good. Henry did what he was told: duck here, brace their hold and do not let go, and learned the one truth ships teach first, that land is an invention and water the premise on which everything else is written. At dawn, because even storms must sleep, the sky ceased to gnash its teeth. The channel opened a grey eye. To the southwest, beyond the broken line of white water, Breton headlands shouldered out of haze, poor, rocky, stubborn and masterless, in a way that appealed to men who needed a corner the rest of the map did not own. They made landfall near the Breton coast. Le Conquet's teeth of rock, men say. Others say a smaller inlet where only local pilots dared thread a path. The exact cove has been smoothed by retelling. What matters is that the Duke of Brittany's men were there before the English kings were. Francis II ruled a duchy that called itself a part French when France pressed English, when England paid Breton always, at least in the way that ports insist they belong mostly to themselves. He received Jasper and the boy with courtesy that stopped just short of commitment. Hospitality, yes. Protection, perhaps. Extradition, no today. In his face, the exiles learned what they would live under for years, a governing calculation whose terms changed with the weather in Paris, London and Bruges. Brittany in those days was a braid of stone towns and heaths of damp forests and bell towers where gulls learned to cry the Angelus. Its independence was a sleight of hand maintained by shrewd treaties and better geography. Its dukes built their capital at Nantes on the Loire's last patient bend, with a castle whose white walls promised safety and whose officials promised as little as language allowed. Farther inland at Vannes, you could walk a circuit of stout medieval walls that made even the confident think about keys. From St. Malo's granite teeth to the soft water meadows near Rennes, the duchy taught its children two arts: how to trade and how to stall. Francis II knew both. He saw in the tall grave boy an asset rare enough to be insured and liquid enough to spend if spending ever offered more profit than interest. Henry learned the duchy as exiles learn places, by small details first. The smell of tar and wet hemp in a harbour warehouse. The way Breton men wrapped their words around their throats, singing even when they cursed. Black bread that tasted of smoke, cider that tasted of knives. Saints' days that seemed to occur every week, and processed through streets so narrow you could drink incense without meaning to. He learned to keep his face plain when introduction ran farther than courtesy. Monseigneur de Richemont, they called him at first, Richmond, his father's English title translated to a French dignity, because to call him anything else would have sounded like taking sides. In private to the small company that had followed Jasper across, he remained only Henry, who could shoot passably and ride very well, and made his points in a Latin his mother would have approved. Pembroke had been a fortress school. Brittany became a dance. Courtiers came and went under Duke Francis's alternating clouds of thrift and generosity. Louis XI, of France, cunning spider, at the centre of a web of silk and iron, sent messages that read like fishing lines. Edward IV of England sent purses and polite threats in the same pouch. The Duke's counsellors weighed, each with scales the exiles could not see. If English gold glittered more brightly this month, the boy might find himself moved inland to a tower among trees. If French danger pressed too close, he might be brought back to a port within a day's ride of ships. Van Nantes, Rennes, their names became refrains in Henry's memory. At one point he was settled among the thick trunks and chill chambers of La Goette's stone tower planted in the forest at Elven, so deep in green that the sea felt like a story told to children. It was safety of a sort. It was also custody. Men spoke to him with every courtesy and wrote of him as if he were a chest to be stored against damp. Jasper did what men do when their swords are taken from them. By necessity he polished the weapons that remain. He taught his nephew to speak carefully and to listen carelessly, by which he meant to hear everything without letting a listener see that he had heard. He drilled him in small companies' discipline, how to keep men fed without insulting them, how to remember the names of those whose names plate over loyalty, how to keep his own feet when a nobleman's welcome turned to a warden's watch. They counted friends, not by declaration, but by repeated usefulness. A Breton captain who misunderstood an order at exactly the right moment. A clerk who misstated a paper so that it could be plausibly found to have said something different. A Carmelite who moved between ports and learned things without being seen to learn them. Back in England, Margaret worked at another kind of edge. The channel that separated her from her son was as narrow as a prayer on maps, and as wide as fate in practice. Letters crossed when they could in the hollow of a pilgrim's staff, or stitched into the hem of a servant's cloak, written small and plain in a hand that had learned how to fit much sense into little paper. Names were avoided, then disguised, then made into puns that only the two of them would hear, a reference to a psalm that meant wait, a proverb about geese that meant go. Wax seals were impressed not with Beaufort's device but with harmless saints. A line in Latin might shift tense in a way that signaled danger to those who knew grammar as well as God. There is no romance in this, only strain the application of the same patience to ink that midwives apply to blood, she added to her web. Merchants from Bristol sailed to Saint-Malo, and back again with bolts of cloth and grains of news. She paid them fairly and asked for no bravado. A goldsmith who supplied a Breton countess with enamel work wrote home about the household he had glimpsed in Nantes, where an English boy kept strange hours and a chapel. A woman who had taken the veil at St. Helens in London, and whose niece had married a sailor, wrote in slow, careful English about a rumour of French envoys sniffing around the Duke's council like hounds at a door. None of it proved anything. All of it kept her from drowning in imagination. Meanwhile, Edward IV regained his balance, and then made a point of dancing on the spot where he had stumbled. He sent offers to Francis II that meant safety for the duchy's harbours, and silver for its coffers, if a certain young man were made inconveniently deliverable to a ship with English colours. He sent threats that meant trouble along the Breton marches with France, if that package failed to appear. Louis XI, who enjoyed the game almost as much as he enjoyed winning it, countered with promises of protection or at least of interest-bearing delay. The Duke practised his smile. He preferred options to choices. He would take English gold and chivalrously not find the boy when the ship arrived. Then when France darkened the horizon, he would keep Henry inland and swear that the matter was being considered by the proper committees of his conscience. No one was deceived. Everyone pretended to be. For Henry the boy, the years began to take shape. He learned the Breton way with horses and the Breton way with time. He made friends where he could, other exiles, a few young Breton gentlemen whose fathers liked to see them speak French with an English accent. He acquired the habit of looking at doorways before entering, and windows before sitting down. He did not acquire swagger, he had no use for it. His reading continued saints' lives because his mother sent them, Caesar's commentaries because his uncle made him, a little French poetry because it was in the air like wood smoke, and because it taught a different way to walk through a sentence. He kept a chapel where Latin sounded like the language of both home and this new place. When he knelt with attention rather than heat. There were moments when exile felt like a game played with the pieces stored in him, a hunting party where the hounds coursed beautifully, and the talk ran like wine, and the compliment to the young Lord of Richmond had one edge too many. A dance in a hall that smelled of beeswax and bay leaves, where the girls' ribbons shone and the floor was as treacherous as other men's manners. A jest told by a Breton officer about English weather that bent unexpectedly into praise of English steel, and eyes that turned toward Henry as if asking him to represent an entire island and its quarrel with itself. He learned to smile as if he had heard only the surface. There were nights when exile felt like punishment, wind fussing at shutters, the sense that a new order might come in the morning and move him like furniture, the knowledge that his presence paid for safety with someone else's risk. He was not yet the man who would land at Milford Haven with French pikes at his back and a crown somewhere beyond cloud. He was a boy in a duchy that could trade him for time. The nobility of endurance is a virtue chroniclers are not paid to make interesting. He practiced it anyway. Margaret, whose endurance had been made in different rooms, came to understand that the most faithful prayer is often a list. She prayed for health in specific nouns, the boy's lungs, his bones, his eyes that had squinted into too much Channel rain. She prayed for weather winds that would carry ships safely and keep other ships ashore. She prayed for small mercies, a scribe who would not be drunk the day he copied a letter that must not fall into the wrong hands, a broken wheel that might delay a message long enough for a messenger to become unnecessary. She prayed for her enemies with the candor of someone who has learned how to talk to God without piety's costume, give them distraction, give them other matters, give them wives who require their presence at inconvenient times. If you want to see how a dynasty begins, do not look only at banners. Look at a ledger in Nantes where the line for foreign pensions is written a little darker that year. Look at an English mother's psalter, where the margin bears a tiny neat correction to the word speravi, I have hoped, so that it reads sparrow, I hope. Look at a boy who has learned to keep his feet when the floor moves, and an uncle who has learned to keep his voice steady when speaking to men who could be friends or jailers depending on the week's price for grain. 14 years, the number looks simple in ink. In living it is a landscape. Henry would grow into it and then out of it, his edges set by a country that owed him nothing and therefore taught him everything a man needs to know about earning loyalty. Brittany, with its strangeness and its bargains, would give him the one gift exile can give to those who survive it, an education in patience that does not curdle into passivity. On this first wet September morning, none of that is visible. There is only a boy leaning against a ship's rail, swallowing the taste of brine and fear, and an uncle who has decided again to be the wall history keeps asking him to be. And there is a woman across a narrow, unfordable sea who holds her breath over a blank map and makes room in her heart for two truths at once, that she may never see her son again and that she intends to. Grief returned without drama. In the autumn of 1471, Sir Henry Stafford's long, slow wound, taken in service of a king who had fallen, then risen, then proved that rise with unanswerable steel, finished its work. The hurt had begun at Barnet that fog-dark Easter, a gash that would not let itself be forgotten, the kind that weeps into a man's temper and his sleep until both are undone. Infection was the centuries-old conspirator. It found him patient. In October, with leaves turning rust on lanes he had ridden for years, he died. There were prayers and the small clatter of household grief platters put down more gently than usual. Doors eased shut, a bell that seemed to count backward as well as forward. Margaret's mourning was a tidy thing. She wore it as she wore everything, precisely as if to give pain. A form is to rob it of some of its appetite. Loss sharpened her rather than hollowed her out. She had learned already that widowhood is not an end state in England, but a legal posture with consequences. A woman's property becomes visible when a husband is removed, and visibility invites hands. The Beaufort estates, those old ribs of her survival, were valuable again in exactly the way they had always been. She would need protection that did not swallow her whole. She would need reach she could borrow, and control she could keep. The answer came in a name that had been moving through other people's calculations for a decade: Stanley. Thomas Lord Stanley did not blaze like the great Nevilles or glitter like the Woodvilles. He was the sort of noble who survives kings because he prefers weather to prophecy. His power was not a single castle, but a geography, the northwest from Lancashire into Cheshire, stitched with manors whose tenants wore his badge and said his name, the way men say the name of a patron saint who answers practical prayers. He had been Lord Chamberlain to Edward IV, a post that keeps a man's ear near the crown's mouth and his hands near the calendar of favours. He had also been, when weather required, at just enough of a distance to say later that he had waited for the law to speak. His brother Sir William was steelier, and would one day make history with a charge. Thomas made a habit of letting other men hurry and arriving exactly when arrival mattered. In 1472, licence obtained from the king, papers done in the order clerks. Prefer Margaret married him. It was not the marriage of a romantic or a penitent. It was the marriage of a strategist, and a man who understood that strategists make good wives. The ceremony was measured, befitting a widow of rank, and a lord who collected advantages as carefully as he collected rents. There were witnesses who could be relied upon to remember what needed remembering, and to forget the rest. There was no operatic reconciliation of Lancastrian and Yorkist banners. There was instead an arrangement as intricate as a piece of needlework held up to the light. The terms read like a lesson she had been writing for years. Her lands remained hedged by feoffees to uses solid enough to make a chancellor sigh. Her revenues were not to be siphoned into other men's debts. Her household officers, those she trusted to move coin and paper without leaving crumbs, stayed in place. Most crucially, and this clause had the quiet force of a vow, her cause as mother to Henry Tudor remained hers to prosecute by all lawful means. No husband would confiscate that allegiance, not even one whose public loyalties tilted York when York was law. Stanley agreed because his genius was consent at the right price. He would gain a wife whose lineage was a key that opened iron doors and a partner whose competence made households hum. She would gain a platform court council, the web of northern affinities, and a shield broad enough to stand under when the sky next broke. Margaret moved into Stanley country and set about conducting influence in a new register. The Stanleys' lordship was a forest of relationships, freeholders and gentry, who owed service gladly, men who would rather have their name on Thomas's roll than anyone else's, priests with nephews in his livery, sheriffs who understood that a quiet county is a kind of gift one gives to a great lord, and is repaid with courts that go well. She made herself legible to that network, pious without fanaticism, generous without waste, attentive without fuss. She learned the local tongues, the cadence of Lancashire speech, the tastes of northern tables, the seasons when men would rather be left to their sheep than summoned to a muster. The lady of the house who had once counted bales and barrels now learned to count men. She did not ask them to die for her. She asked them to answer when called, and to say who else would answer with them. At court, where Stanley's office returned her to rooms that had once regarded a Beaufort with suspicion and now regarded her with interest, she practiced a different art, the traffic of women. Queens and queens' ladies make a climate within which policy either ripens or rots. Margaret let her devotions introduce her to Elizabeth Woodville's circle books and beads, arms and altars where conversation could be sincere and still serve as intelligence. She sent small gifts whose meanings were larger than their size, a psalter copied in a hand, so lovely it all but sang, a reliquary with a sliver of some saint no one could quite identify, lengths of good cloth for a layette, sent quietly to a cousin of the Queen who had more children than pin money. She wrote to Neville widows in terms that honoured their grievance without sharing their rage. She commissioned a mass here, a pilgrimage there, and made sure the right people heard of both. Nothing in these gestures broke a law. Everything in them built a path she might later need to run. The correspondence with Brittany threaded itself through these new routes. Jasper's hand was as square as ever. Henry's, when he wrote, had lengthened into a young man's script that looked like water deciding to be a river. Margaret's replies carried both mother and minister. She traded gossip of court sanitized with an elegance that delighted Jasper, because gossip is the sugar-coating that helps hard truths go down. She explained which lords had forgiven whom and what forgiveness had cost. She described a feast without lingering on luxury, then slid into a paragraph about a northern tenant riot and how swiftly it had been calmed. An object lesson to a boy who would one day need to know which fires to stamp and which to warm, his hands over. Thomas Stanley did not interfere. He was a practical husband who knew that to marry a woman like Margaret is to accept that she comes with a vocation. He provided cover the way good roofs do without creaking. When the King's Council sniffed at a letter in an unwise courier's pouch, Thomas had already expressed in general terms concern for the welfare of certain English gentlemen abroad, whose loyalty might someday be better housed. When a sheriff asked an impertinent question of a chaplain known to carry notes under his sleeve, Thomas smiled and remarked that the man's Latin was poor, which in that time was almost an indictment. The Northwest remained quiet. Quiet counties are coins at court. He spent the coin of order and bought in exchange the right not to be asked why his wife prayed so earnestly for a boy beyond the sea. Margaret's chapel thickened with intention. She endowed obits for Henry Stafford with an exactitude that impressed even clerks who disliked counting. She added prayers for Edmund Tudor that made a neat bracket of her past. She took into her patronage one or two houses of women, places where books were loved and talk was careful, and where a letter could be sent under the cover of a request for new antiphoners. She let rumour do its work. The Lady Margaret spends too much time at her prayers, said people who could not imagine that prayer sometimes moves like a courier through the gaps in other men's intelligence. Did she speak with Margaret of Anjou, the Iron Queen now in French exile? Not in words we have, but networks have a way of letting messages pass, even when senders have become symbols rather than correspondents. A courtesy sent to a lady of Anjou's dwindled court, a reliquary passed from hand to hand that arrived at its destination with a note, in an easily deniable cipher, a Breton merchant's wife who found unexpectedly safe lodgings in a Stanley manor when she crossed the narrow sea for such circuits. A name like Beaufort is both passport and password. Her son grew older in Brittany's conditional shade. She grew older in England's conditional light. Between them, the bargain of this marriage proved itself. Stanley's house gave her reach at court and muscle in the shires. Margaret's name gave Stanley a link to a cause he could neither own nor afford to ignore. If the king asked, he could say with plausible weariness that he had married a pious widow for her competence and the comfort of his household. If her friends asked, they could say with quiet satisfaction that she had married a man who kept doors open and enemies busy, and who believed that a wise stepfather protects a boy by protecting the boy's mother. In private, between the rosary and the ledger, Margaret refined her art of waiting into an institution. She did not repeat her wishes out loud when they could be written once and sent. She did not rehearse grievances, she rehearsed outcomes. She did not pretend danger had passed because the house was warm. She wrote another layer onto the legal palimpsest that guarded her lands. She cultivated a habit in her servants that would save her life later, the appearance of dullness. A clever maid is a liability when the sheriff comes. A maid who looks as if she knows only how to boil water can hide a letter under a rim of pewter no man will think to finger. Widow again, then wife again, Lancastrian in marrow, living under a Yorkist sun, the mother of a boy whose absence had become the shape of her days. Margaret did not waste breath, wishing the world were simpler. She made it bearable by making it legible. The marriage to Thomas Stanley was not a romance, it was a hinge. When it swung years later on a muddy Leicestershire field, the door it opened would make men sing. For now it opened something quieter, and nearly as hard to win, a space in which a woman could work unglamorous and exact toward a future she had promised herself and her God long before anyone else believed it could be kept. Edward IV died, as great men sometimes do mid-sentence. The 9th of April 1483. Holy Week's hush still in the air, he slipped from a life that had learned to enjoy its own brightness, wine, women, wardrobes, victories. Physicians muttered about a chill taken too recklessly or a constitution worn by excess. Clerks wrote piously of God's timing. What mattered to England was the hole his death made. A boy of 12, Edward V inherited the title and none of its instruments. The realm reached, as it always does in such moments, for someone whose name calmed the room. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's younger brother, the hard one, the loyal one, stepped forward as Lord Protector, and in that first week wore the role with the gravity that keeps councils from breaking into smaller pieces, and then gravity turned to gravity's shadow. At Stony Stratford, Richard intercepted the young king's progress toward London, arrested the boy's Woodville kin Earl Rivers Sir Richard Grey, and escorted Edward V to the capital with a courtesy that so perfectly concealed control it barely counted as concealment. London received them with careful cheer. The Protector took up residence near the Tower, and the city, which has always preferred a plan to a pedigree, tried to believe this was the sort of regency that ends with a neat coronation and everyone keeping their heads. The belief lasted until the 13th of June, when William Lord Hastings, Edward IV's immovable friend, the kind of steadying weight that makes a table stand, was hauled from the council chamber and beheaded on Tower Green without trial. There was talk of sorcery, of the Queen's family plotting, of a net of treason newly discovered. Men do not invent charges like that when they are confident. A week later, the sermon at St. Paul's Cross put language to what had already happened in fact. Dr. Ralph Shaw, voice borrowed by policy, told the city that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. Their children, he said, were illegitimate, unable by law to inherit the crown. It was not neat truth. It was, however, neat law if you accepted it. Crowds are good at accepting what they cannot change. Parliament would soon tidy this theology into statute as titulus regius, a title so sure of itself it might as well have been carved into the church steps. On the 26th of June, Richard accepted what the sermon and the statute had prepared the call to be king. On the 6th of July 1483, he wore the crown as Richard III, and if any man in the abbey heard the self-clicking shut like a trap, he was wise enough not to say so aloud. The boys, Edward V and his little brother Richard of York, were housed in the Tower, which was in that century both palace and prison depending upon who held the keys. They played in the gardens, appeared at windows, waved. Then they did not. Summer deepened, and rumour, which is London's other season, ripened to rot. They have been removed, people whispered, which in practice meant nothing. Absence is not proof. Yet absence in a fortress is a language of its own, and the city learned it as one learns to read a face. The princes vanished into that most efficient of English rooms, the space where the thing everyone suspects is never said outright, and therefore never pardoned. The moral vertigo began there, in that refusal to be certain, and that certainty no one dared to own. Thomas Stanley, master of arrives late, but arrives bent with the wind, and made a show of finding the new arrangement sensible. He attended, he nodded. He kept his household as quiet as winter fields. Margaret, whose disposability had been a subject of debate for 30 years, did not change her blood or the habit of reading the weather. She watched Richard III settle his crown with one hand and unsheathe the other. Attainders, those surgical statutes that erase men from their lands, went out like well-aimed knives. So did pardons, because rule requires a mixture. The North loved Richard. He had ruled it justly for years. London was impressed by his energy and alarmed by his nerve. The shires did what shires do, took instructions, and waited for the next set. Then the ground creaked. The man who first brought the noise to Richard's door was an unlikely rebel Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, kin to Margaret's late second husband, and once Richard's indispensable ally. Buckingham had ridden beside Richard in June, played herald to the king's cause, smiled with the air of a man whose cousinship and competence would be rewarded in weight. By autumn he had changed his mind. Motives are a feast ambition, ill-fed conscience ill-slept. Bishop John Morton's patient whispering conducted under a custody that was really a colloquy. Morton, clever, dry a servant of order, more than of party, had been parked by Richard in Buckingham's care, a prudent captivity that turned into the worst kind of apprenticeship. If you want a duke to doubt a usurper's soul, give him a bishop who can teach history as leverage. The scheme that emerged in half-lit rooms ran on 3 rails. In the south, Kent and the Thames Valley would rise. In the west, Buckingham would gather Welshmen and storm eastward like weather. From across the narrow sea, Henry Tudor, quiet boy of Pembroke, taller now, and finished by exile into something resembling steel, would sail with Breton, French help, and insert himself at the moment of greatest need. The last rail bore a promise as thin as parchment and as strong that if God granted Henry a crown, he would marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. Red rose to white, not as surrender but as ligature. The policy was also a story, and stories move men even when policies fail to. It said this is how the quarrel ends without burning the house. Margaret moved as if the map were under her feet. She sent money across in small deniable parcels. She promised more. She drafted letters with a confessor's caution and a lawyer's craft. She sent them by hands that could plausibly claim ignorance of the load they carried. She leaned on the women whose tables and beds lay where men's power meets men's inattention, ladies who would share a rumour with exactly the person who needed to hear it, and no one else. She bent Thomas no farther than he would bend himself. He allowed the appearance of a wife too pious and well-bred to do mischief. He allowed a little more than that because he knew that a shelter can be built from indulgences the law cannot retail. The plans stumbled over the oldest enemy of plans, weather. On the 3rd of October 1483, Henry sailed from Brittany in a modest fleet. Storms unstitched his ships, scattered his captains, and shoved him toward a Devon shore that refused to speak the signal it had been coached to say. He hovered off Plymouth, some say pool weary of banners that looked too conveniently his. If he landed into Richard's net, it would end not in triumph but in a London square with a scaffold and a speech. He chose to turn back, and that act caution's clearest hour saved the future at the cost of the present. While he beat against an unfriendly wind, Buckingham's rising failed for a harder reason. The Severn flooded the roads, turned to porridge, and men who had promised to march discovered that oaths sink in autumn mud. The Duke drifted westward like a log seeking a shore, was taken in disguise, and died at Salisbury with a headsman's bad aim, correcting itself on the second stroke. Rebellions end like this as often as they end in ballads. Richard III did what rulers do who have newly felt the floor tilt. He fixed names to treason, he named prices, he rewarded the faithful with other men's homes, and he harvested fear with the same calm he had used to harvest favour. He might have broken Margaret entirely in that moment. Instead, with a shrewdness that speaks to either mercy or management, he placed her under house arrest in the custody of her husband, a phrase so elegant it forgets to be iron. Her lands were forfeit to Thomas Stanley during her life, which meant the crown got obedience without the fuss of garrisoning manors, and Margaret got a roof that her enemies controlled on paper, and she controlled in practice. Thomas managed the show, a guard, who looked as if he would notice more than he did. An accounting submitted when asked. A perfumed protestation that his wife had no business beyond pilgrims' paths and poor men's bowls. She shrank herself before witnesses and walked rooms broader than ever when the witnesses left. Across the Channel, Henry made his vow. Christmas Day, 1483-inch Rennes Cathedral beneath a forest of candles, and the stone ribs of Breton pride, he swore before God and those willing to hazard their estates that if he should win England he would marry Elizabeth of York. The oath was an act of statecraft disguised as romance, a bet on the power of symbols that outlive statutes. It told Yorkists with tired consciences they could have both loyalty and peace. It told Lancastrians with long memories they would not be asked to bow to the man they had hated, but to the marriage that would make hatred obsolete. It told France and Brittany that their investment might bring not only a friendly king but a quiet channel. It told one woman in England kneeling in a chapel under guard that her arithmetic had not been folly. Red to white, white to red. Roses do not end wars, but the stories we tell about roses sometimes do. Bishop Morton slipped the net into Flanders and then into the service of the hope he had helped to nurture. Messages thickened across the winter sea like skeins. The French king's daughter's council, Anne of Beaujeu, watched with the careful malice of a regency that likes England better divided than decided. Duke Francis of Brittany haggled for advantage, sometimes selling Henry dear to the highest bidder, in promises sometimes cashiering English gold into the Breton chest, and misplacing the delivery note. Margaret, under watch and unblinking, kept a household that looked like devotion and acted like a relay station. Priests came and went, alms went out, and information came in. She learned who Richard pardoned and whom he could not. She learned which sheriffs drank too much and which drank just enough. She learned to measure the realm's temper by how loudly London laughed in taverns and how long northern musters practiced before they said they were ready. Richard III's Parliament met in January 1484 and wrote the realm into a posture he could defend. Titulus Regius nailed shut rebels named estates, redistributed proclamations about the king's justice poured like warm ale at a winter fair. There were real reforms among the thunder promises about fair access to the courts, about halting extortionate practices enough to remind honest men why they had loved Richard Duke of Gloucester before they learned to fear Richard King. Yet no statute could reclaim the summer's absence. The prince's silence spoke louder than any reform. By spring the rebellion's ashes looked cold. Margaret learned to breathe so quietly that the guard outside her chapel sometimes forgot to listen. Thomas learned, as husbands sometimes do, to value a wife whose quiet kept the house upright in bad weather. Henry learned that failure survived can be a kind of capital. He would try again when the wind and France and fortune all found the same direction. And when he did, he would bring with him a promise large enough to be a policy, and a policy human enough to be a promise that two broken houses could be bound without erasing the past that broke them. For now the realm walked carefully, in a world where sermons could unmake princes and statutes could make a king, where a bishop's advice could turn a duke and a storm could turn a war, where a woman could be imprisoned inside her husband's courtesy and still reach across a sea. Between London's new order and Brittany's old patience lay a thin taut line. Margaret held it with one hand rosary in the other and taught herself not to flinch when it sang. House arrest is a phrase that sounds like stillness. Margaret made of it a new kind of movement. The king's order put her in the custody of her husband. Her estates were granted during her life to Thomas Stanley, which meant theoretically that a woman who had once directed her own affairs must now ask leave to break her own seal. Practically, it meant the household performed obedience as theatre, while its mistress turned every corridor into a message and every ritual into a road. The guard at her door learned her timetable and mistook predictability for harmlessness. Servants learned to make the noisier work. Trenching, scouring, coal bins hammered open coincide with those hours when a small packet might be slid beneath a floor rush or a word passed across a threshold. The chapel became a signal station. Alms days multiplied, and with them the comings and goings of the poor faces that blur to men in livery and remain in high relief to a woman who knows which widow from which parish has a brother who sails out of Bristol twice a year. A pair of beads left on a pew meant go. A ribbon in a particular colour tied at the end of a stall meant wait. A single coin of a certain mint pressed into a palm meant burn what I gave you and walk away. A priest, Christopher Urswick, sharp-eyed and soft-voiced, appeared as almoner and stayed as something else, confessor to the appearance of piety and courier to its intention. He carried letters written on slivers of vellum thin enough to hide inside the spine of a book. He carried messages that were not letters at all, a saint's name spoken with emphasis. A text assigned for meditation whose chapter number answered a question. Books themselves became devices. A psalter that had belonged to her grandmother acquired marginal pricks, pinprick constellations that, when read, line by line, spelled warnings. A volume of saints' lives went to a friend at court with a leaf deliberately misbound a page that fell out when the cover was opened, its blank side bearing the neatest, smallest, boldest script a sober hand could make. On washing days, parchment packets rode inside the pleats of linens laid to dry in the buttery, where steam fogged the sight of men who had no wish to stand long among women's work. In the still room where rosemary hung like a small forest and glass bottles caught the morning, a recipe for a cordial included measurements that, when copied by a helpful niece and sent to a cousin, resolved into numbers for coin and names for ports. Stanley, whose whole life had been a negotiation between power and prudence, managed the impression the crown required. He submitted accounts showing the lady's household expenses as notably pious wax bread for the poor moneys for repair of roads that pilgrims used. He permitted a watch that watched what it had been told to watch. He observed when required that his wife's health was delicate and her mind altogether turned to God. None of this was a lie. The truth, as Margaret arranged it, simply had a second floor built above it where other truths lived. Letters dispatched to Brittany, promises measured out to men who might be persuaded to stand aside at the crucial hour, inventories adjusted so that coin could be found quickly without leaving a hole the exchequer would notice. The realm beyond the guarded door went on remaking itself. In April 1484, Richard III's only son, Edward of Middleham, Prince of Wales, died at Middleham, a blow so intimate the king was seen to weep publicly. The human sorrow did not soften the politics. It made them worse. A king without an heir is a king turned toward the future with nothing to point to. Rumour, the element in which London swims, began to say ugly things. Richard's queen, Anne Neville, was pale and often unwell. If she died, she would in March 1485, would the king, God save us, marry his niece Elizabeth of York. The tale stank and spread anyway. Gossip has always been the solvent of legitimacy. For Yorkists with consciences tired by the summer of 1483, Henry Tudor's old promise to marry Elizabeth began to feel less like treason and more like a bridge to decency. In Sanctuary, and then out of it, Elizabeth Woodville recalculated. Richard had coaxed her from Westminster in 1484 with oaths and public gestures. Her daughters came to court. The move blunted the sharpness of the alliance she had made with Margaret in the crisis of 1483. Still, a filament of understanding remained. If a decent end to the quarrel could be engineered, mothers would do it. Margaret's letters to Elizabeth, carried by women whose names did not appear on any roster, were devotional in tone and sharp in content. A psalm about meeting mercy and truth upon the road. A line about the daughter who brings peace. A mention of cloth dyed in white and red for a church hanging. Anyone might read them. Those who had been taught how read the second page, written not in ink but in illusion. Keep the girl ready. Teach her the patience of queens who must wait in silence. Do not let hope be seen on your face. Across the narrow sea, hope was learning to sit on a different set of chairs. In Brittany, Duke Francis II's treasury and nerve were managed by Pierre Landais, a minister with a merchant's eye and a usurer's appetite. Landais treated Henry Tudor as a negotiable instrument, a bill to be discounted with England for gold, then perhaps redeemed with France for protection, then perhaps returned to the drawer if the calculation changed. In 1484, Richard III tested the balance. He sent envoys with pleasant faces and heavy purses to propose that the troublesome young Englishman be handed over in exchange for alliance and coin. Landais listened the way bankers do when the borrower they like has stopped paying and the borrower they fear is offering cash. He considered, he temporized, and then when the sum seemed right, he decided. Jasper sensed it first. He had been living among half-promises too long not to recognize the smell of betrayal wrapped in courtesy. Orders came to move the English exiles inland where the Duke kept his chests and his leverage. Courtesies thinned. A Breton captain's kindness hardened into compliance. Then, with a speed that made the whole business look like a parable of fortunes in attention, Henry moved. He and Jasper slipped the Breton net and crossed into France, helped by officers tired of Landais's grip, and by a regency that understood England better than Brittany did. In Paris and at the smaller courts where France keeps her sharper tools, the boy from Pembroke found at last the shape of open support. France was in the hands of Anne of Beaujeu, elder sister to boy King Charles VIII. A woman celebrated even by enemies for the clarity with which she balanced accounts of coin and policy. She did not love Henry for his smile. She valued him for his nuisance value. An English king made in France would owe. An English king made by France would fear. She offered money, ships, and men adventurers they would be called, though they were in truth professionals whose armour had weathered more than a little weather. Philibert de Chandé, cool competent later to be made Earl of Bath, gathered lances. John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, exiled, iron-willed, stepped forward as commander who knew how to turn hired pikes into a true line. In taverns along the Seine, men drank to a campaign that smelled like work and not like romance. Henry learned the awkward courtesy of being helped by those who intend to collect. He sat in rooms where men spoke of him as if he were across the hall and learned not to flinch. He signed promises the way one signs for goods on credit, aware that delivery day will come. He became almost overnight the sort of figure men practiced their faces for magnates from England's west and north, who had slipped abroad for reasons that sounded like pilgrimage, mercenaries who liked a cause that paid, and a commander who listened, clerks who had added up enough columns to know that war is a ledger as well as a trumpet. He kept the forms even when the rooms made him restless. Mass salute consultation, sleep drill drill drill. Landais fell. In the summer of 1485 Breton nobles, who had had their fill of a treasurer who treated their duchy like a counting house, rose against him. On the 19th of July they hanged him, a cautionary figure, dangling at the edge of a road Margaret could not see but understood perfectly. Francis II lived on. He would die in 1488, after his own last losing battle with France. But his minister's end altered the sums. Brittany could no longer barter Henry as a chit. France would spend him as a policy. Between her guarded walls and his furnished lodgings, the mother and the son tightened their language to a wire. She sent names that were not names, the man of the river for a lord in the west who would make a road safe, the man of the bells for one in the north whose tenants would march when the tocsin sounded. She sent measures that were not measures, enough flour for 3 ovens, meaning enough coin to pay 300 men for a month. She sent counsel that weighed nothing and everything: do not land where they expect you. Do not write to those who do not burn what they read. Do not count a man loyal simply because he has been wronged. He wrote back with lines that would have satisfied any bishop and steadied any captain. My lady mother, I thank God I am in health and good courage. Pray for me. Followed by the single practical question that proves a general: if the Stanleys stand aside, will they move when pushed? At home, Margaret's household rehearsed departures no one could admit were contemplated. The chest that held her psalter held also a small stock of coin in mixed denominations that could pay for bread in a village without calling attention to itself. A sumpter horse was kept shod and half-packed under the fiction that the lady might choose a pilgrimage any day to a nearby shrine. Linen was laid by that would fit a man who might arrive wet and without a change. Within the limits of surveillance she could not disrupt, she made ready to snap her life shut like a travelling case and move toward whatever signal would be sent. Richard strengthened where he could. He toured, he dispensed justice, he rewarded men whose names would matter in a summons. He buried his queen in the spring of 1485 with a ceremony owed a Neville and a consort. He denied with injured dignity any thought of marrying his niece. He made Lord Howard Duke of Norfolk for service, and so scratched one more name into the column of men who would come when called. He lodged his enemies where lodging could be watched. He wrote to the north where his name still carried more weight than any whispered rumour, and asked for men. He watched the coast. The hinge was almost ready to swing. The house in which Margaret had been kept had become a quiet arsenal of moments and messages. The court where Henry had been hosted had become a spring. The Stanleys, Thomas Cautious, William Flintier, stood between weighing costs as if they had an abacus instead of a conscience. The map resolved to a few names: Milford Haven, Shrewsbury, Lichfield, Bosworth. Dates gathered like storm clouds. The last letters crossed the last water. Margaret's final instructions were as practical and unromantic as her prayers: land west, move fast, call Oxford to the van, trust Resap Thomas if he sees the wind change, keep the boy from the melee until it matters. The guard at her door, hearing only the murmur of Compline, shifted his weight and yawned. He was bored. Boredom is what revolutions eat first. The ships nosed into Mill Bay just south of Milford Haven on the 7th of August 1485, the water flat as if exhausted by other men's storms. A red dragon flew from Henry's mast, Cadwallader's beast, an old Welsh memory sewn into new cloth because banners like stories can march faster than men. He stepped ashore not as a prince greeted by trumpets, but as a claimant whose capital was resolve. Jasper's veterans dropped to familiar routines, landing securing counting heads, while Philibert de Chanday's French lances blinked at the dull, beautiful country that was about to decide whether it would keep them. Wales listened. You can hear a whole people listening if you have been away long enough. The march east began with courtesies and tests. Haverfordwest opened its gates. Carmarthen measured the size of the rumour and judged it large enough to bow to. Resap Thomas, Lord of the Southwest, the fulcrum on which the road might tilt, weighed what to do with a nephew of England carried back by France. Pledges were made that leave the chroniclers guessing, and the result plain: Rees and his men joined. The column grew as rivers do by tributaries that remember the sea. Henry rode in the centre with a small guard, and the air of a man who understands that confidence is not a costume but a schedule. Rise. Before the camp, pray, consult, ride. Ask, listen, ride again. He had learned in Brittany to keep his eyes on doorways and his questions simple. He learned in Wales that a quiet word at a ford can gain you more men than a proclamation shouted from a hill. They moved through Cardigan and then northeast to Machynlleth, turning toward the spine of the country. Jasper's roots were the instinct of a man who had spent years galloping these roads in good weather and bad. At Newtown, the column angled for England. At Shrewsbury, the 15th of August, the town admitted them with a civic smile that did not hide the way hands tightened on coin. The seven curled like a question at their feet. Bridges and fords were answered by barges and charm. From Shrewsbury they went by Newport to Stafford, then down toward Lichfield, where the great spire, 3 spires actually like a crown stuck upside down into the earth, speared the sky and made men think about vows. They halted at Atherstone on the 21st of August, and the night was full of messages going the wrong way on purpose. The Stanleys were everywhere and nowhere. Thomas Lord Stanley, called away by a chronic and famously useful sickness, kept one army and a set of expressions for every visitor. His brother Sir William kept another and fewer expressions. Between them they had a county's worth of men who knew how to stand just far enough away to make a king uneasy. Richard III had seen this posture before and had taken a hostage against it, Lord Strange Thomas's son, a young man with better nerves than his father and worse luck. When Strange tried to slip the leash, Richard made of him a message, "Fight me and the boy dies." Thomas replied like a man who has lived a long time with Power's arithmetic, "I will serve my king, but my sickness is real. I cannot yet ride. I hope to be there when honour allows." He sent word to Henry as well, words that could be read 2 ways and were meant to be, "I cannot move now, but do not despair. I will help when help will be help." Dawn on the 22nd of August smeared itself over Leicestershire fields, pale and tired of men. The ground undulated a low ridge at Ambion where Richard made his camp, a scatter of hedges, a strip of marsh that would prove argument and answer. Richard's army was larger, and arranged as such things are arranged when a king means to be seen. Norfolk with the vanguard, Northumberland behind. The king's own household poised for the moment when the centre must be shored up or glory seized. Henry's was smaller, tighter, and under John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, arranged like a thought sharpened to a point. Oxford had been learning from the new wars Burgundian French, and he pressed the men into ranks no more than 10 deep so that arrows might thin their edges, but not enter their heart. He cautioned against pursuit. He forbade the scattering that turns victory into men chasing stories of themselves. The Stanleys took position on either side of the field like weather, making up its mind. Richard sent again for Thomas, "Come to my banner." What he received back was the illness restated. He threatened Strange. He moved. Henry saw the space open between hope and help, and made the decision that would be called audacity later, and was in the moment the only way to keep the day from dissolving. He shifted his small escort toward the Stanleys, not to force their hand so much as to invite it. Arrows began their arithmetic, and for a while the field made the same noise. Such fields always make impact breath, the short vocabulary of men in armour. Norfolk pressed and Oxford held. The French pikes took ground as if cutting cloth. Henry's standard blew and dragons tilted and righted like a ship. Somewhere in the middle hours the battle began to wobble. Northumberland's force, large enough to tilt the day, did not move. Whether held back by order or by caution that wanted to see where the coin would land, it stood like a fact that could not be altered. Richard saw the hesitation and answered in the language. Kings speak when a crown is not secure on their head. He gathered his household, pointed his horse, as if pointing the spear that held the realm together, and drove straight for Henry. It was a line, not a melee. Richard meant to end the day with 1 kill. He cut down men who had been names at breakfast and would be footnotes by supper. Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, fell there. John Chain Massive went down under the blow of a king who had learned to make force an argument. Henry's escort bent. A gap opened such that you could see for a breath the pure idea, a king, a claimant, a decision hurtling toward them. Then William Stanley moved. His men surged down like a thought finally spoken, hit Richard's flank, and changed physics into history. Horses tried to turn where the ground did not want them to. Men who had mastered the art of staying on their feet discovered that mud has an opinion. Richard did not run. Even his enemies allow him that. He fought within a circle that narrowed and held until it did not. When he fell all the way, armour-torn, open crown, somewhere other than a head, a brief, obscene intimacy of steel and body. The cry that goes up at the end of such a life is not noble, it is relief with fear still inside it. The king's banner wavered and went down. Northumberland's calculations set like cooling metal. Norfolk was dead, and the men whose names had been written into this morning began to remember other names, wives, saints, the road home. Someone found the crown where ballad makers still like to find it, snagged on a hawthorn bright on thorns. Thomas Stanley lifted it heavy as decisions are, and set it on Henry's head. Field coronations are not law, but they are theatre, and theatre persuades. Men who a moment earlier had been fighting for their lives raised a cry that tried to sound like unanimity and succeeded at sounding like exhaustion. Henry Tudor became Henry VII because enough men were alive to agree it had happened, and enough dead were available to prove there would be no argument. After the practicalities, the dead king's body stripped and thrown across a horse face to the world because policy demands cruelty when legitimacy is new. The lists of pardons and exceptions already being drafted in the heads of secretaries who thought faster than they prayed. The careful dating of a reign from the day before the battle, the 21st of August, so that anyone who had drawn sword on the 22nd had in retrospect committed treason. Oxford kept the men from scattering into banditry. Jasper kept the young king from generosity that overpromises and anger that spends allies for the pleasure of a moment. The Stanleys rode carefully away from the appearance of authorship and into the safer role of instruments, men who could be rewarded without seeming to command the king who rewarded them. News outran horses. In London, people looked up from bread and wondered if the rumours were at last true. In the north, men accustomed to trusting Richard's justice stared at the space his death had made and tried to fill it with obedience. In Westminster's cool stone, Margaret Beaufort's guard grew bored and then alert and then polite as a message came that could not be stopped by custody. The king requires the presence of his mother. She had been waiting all her life to hear those words. She did not run. She rose as women who have learned to turn breath into policy always rise, composed, exact already, measuring how much grief could be allowed into joy before either became a spectacle. When they met, whether first at Leicester's Grey Friars lodging house or in London days later, chroniclers place their ink carefully and leave us only the right thing to imagine he bent, and she blessed him. Not as a subject blesses a sovereign, though the forms were observed, but as a mother's hand knows a brow better than any crown does. He called her Madam, and then with a formality that would harden into title and office, my lady the king's mother. It was a style and a settlement. Queens sit beside kings, mothers make kings possible and then stand where they can see. He gave her precedence above all women, save the one he would marry. He gave her rooms and revenues, and more importantly, reach. She gave him the thing she had been practicing since the day he was born, advice that saves more than it spends. That night, when the noise had receded to corridors, and the air smelled of damp armour and new paper, Henry's councillors set out the first acts of a reign that would be legal as much as martial. Proclamations were drafted, a coronation date floated. Messengers sent to secure the person of Elizabeth of York to keep faith with a promise made in a Breton cathedral and a winter-green chapel. Margaret's work did not end, it acquired a different light. The rosary in her hand had the same weight. The ledgers had larger sums. The discipline was unchanged, thank God. Count, write, wait, move. The field where a crown had been found on a thorn and placed upon a brow lay quiet under late summer light. Marsh reeds recovered, stubborn, as people who must go on being reeds. Men who had been heroes or villains over breakfast were in pits. The country exhaled, suspicious of peace and longing for it. In that breath a dynasty took its first true step. A mother who had once screamed in a Welsh castle and called that scream a vow, walked forward to keep it. A crown placed on a battlefield must be made legal in stone. Henry entered London in September to bells that sounded relieved more than jubilant. On October's end, Westminster bright with cloth of gold and beeswax, the new king took the oil and the oaths first, and only afterward, when law had been wrapped around conquest, did he set about making peace look like policy. Parliament followed swiftly and did the work that parchment does best, backdating the start of his reign to the day before Bosworth, so that opposition became treason by the neatest of legal fictions, reversing and then reapplying attainders with a pen that knew when to punish and when to recruit. And in an act that felt like a window flung open, repealing Titulus Regius, the statute that had called the children of Edward IV bastards, and ordering it destroyed, as if fire could cauterize doubt. It could not, but it helped. He moved carefully around the promise that had carried him over water and through Wales. He would not owe his crown to a bride, he would offer it to one. So he married Elizabeth of York on the 18th of January 1486, in Westminster red and white roses braided into a new badge and a new story, two families that had drained the realm now binding it back into itself. The marriage was political and also in time companionable, which is a rarer blessing than poets pretend. The pageant was followed by proof. In September at Winchester, where kings like to pretend they touch Arthurian roots, a son arrived, Arthur, Prince of Wales, small, weighty miracle. Banners went up, purses opened, oaths were renewed. The realm inhaled as if the winter might be over. Margaret stood just to the side of all that light, and by stepping aside stepped higher. My lady the king's mother, it sounded like a courtesy and proved to be an office. Precedence placed her immediately below the queen. Policy placed her in rooms where decisions are seasoned before they are served. An early act of Henry's Parliament gave her what English law rarely granted married women: the capacity to own and manage property, to sue, and be sued, to act in her own name as if she were unmarried and a man. She had been practicing that condition for years. Now it had a statute to sit on. She kept her title in her own right, Countess of Richmond, and added the weight of Derby from her third marriage to Thomas Stanley. When she sealed a letter, the wax carried a history and a horizon. She kept two households, one near the court when presence was power, one at Collie Weston in Northamptonshire, a great ordered hive where bees wore livery. There she made of domestic life a form of governance. Accounts balanced to the penny. Alms went out on a schedule that turned compassion into habit. The chapel clocked her day as if prayer were the spine that held everything erect. She dressed austerely, a shade away from the half-veil of a vowed widow. She ate sparingly. She smiled without inviting familiarity. Servants who came into her orbit learned a language of exactness, linen folded to standard, figures presented legibly, gossip translated into relevance or dismissed. When she travelled, it was with the careful thunder of a person who understands that movement too is message. Elizabeth of York's confinements drew on Margaret's appetite for order. She arranged midwives and linens with the same seriousness she once devoted to letters passed under watch. She stood sponsor at christenings, corrected a wandering chorister with a lifted eyebrow, and made sure the heat in a chamber did not tempt fever. She did not invade the Queen's rooms. She ensured they worked. When the court required pageant, she could stage manage ceremony, until symbolism seemed to occur by itself, white and red damasks set like an argument resolved. Candles counted for effect and economy, prayers chosen to praise God without tempting fate. The public romance of the Tudor rose leaned invisibly on a woman who had learned not to waste either breath or coin. If counsel was needed, often it came late at night when ceremonial quieted and ledgers were closed. She had been training for the role since Pembroke to listen without letting a man drown in his own eloquence, to ask the one question that turned policy from appetite into plan, to count backwards from a decision to the stores, roads, and names that would pay for it. Henry had brought with him the virtues of exile, frugality, patience, a distaste for surprise, and she sharpened them. He trusted few. She helped him choose the few better. He distrusted debt. She devised gifts that cost less than they yielded offices that ate a man's days, and therefore kept him loyal pardons that bound a conscience because they had been offered quietly. Between king and council, her presence was a hand on the tiller that never grabbed and never let go. Her son's household became a blueprint for the new way. In 1494, when Arthur was sent to Ludlow to preside in name over the Council of Wales ordinances, set his day with the gravity of a small cosmos mass at fixed hours. Accounts read, servants' numbers regulated, access graded like a road between town and castle. Margaret's touch is in those pages, the insistence that discipline be kind, that learning crest the day that expenditure served visibility, only when visibility served policy. She knew what a prince is, a promise that must be protected from both flattery and famine. She saw to tutors who could teach Latin and law, to chaplains who could pray and keep counsel, to stewards who counted grain with the same care they counted men. The wider marriage of England to the world went through rooms she knew well. The Treaty of Medina del Campo, 1489, set Arthur on a path toward Catherine of Aragon, and Margaret's neat hand appears in the periphery's etiquette precedents, the delicate shipping of dignity across sea. When Catherine landed for the 1501 wedding, London burst into its most hospitable self-pageants along Cheapside tapestries speaking Old Testament comfort. Margaret checked lists and made sure buckets stood where horses would need them, and that the arches would not shed gilding onto Spanish silk in rain. When Arthur and Catherine married, the mother who had remade a country by surviving stood in a nave that had known her prayers for decades and counted candles rather than tears. Learning became her later life banner. She had loved books since a Bedfordshire priest taught her to keep Latin straight under pressure. Now she turned that affection into stone and salary. In 1502 she endowed the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at both Oxford and Cambridge, a permanent paid attention to the things she believed steadied kingdom's right teaching. In 1505 she refounded God's House at Cambridge as Christ's College, emptying and rebuilding until the place looked like clarity courts proportioned to foster order, a chapel that gathered breath rather than dramatized it, statutes that made scholarship a rhythm instead of a pose. She set in motion the making of St. John's College too, its charter realized after her death by a grandson who wore crowns easily and scruples less so. She gave money, yes, but more importantly method endowments that outlived donors, fellowships that multiplied minds, discipline that made structures speak. Printing the century's strange fire warmed her rooms. She patronized the presses that made English devotion audible in English houses, Wynkyn de Worde and Richard Pinson among them, sponsoring translations of the sorts of books a woman could carry into a chapel and come out more herself. Imitation of Christ turned into clean English, guides for meditation that taught silence how to sit deeper. Her prologues were brief and without vanity. Her arms in the margins were less a boast than a postal address. These words passed through this woman's hands and can be trusted to steady you. In a realm still learning to read itself, she made piety legible. With Thomas Stanley she practiced a virtuous distance that scandalized no one and fascinated everyone. They had been partners by design. In later years they were neighbors by arrangement. Households dovetailed affection, expressed as interlocking protections. She is said to have vowed chastity within that marriage, a decision that read to the century like piety, and to Margaret like coherence. Her body had paid its price early. Her vocation had been chosen for her, and then chosen by her. She moved between her houses without caprice. He moved around her work without interruption. When he died in 1504, she wore the proper grief without letting duty slacken. The room where she met ambassadors looked much like the room where she met confessors, a table with papers, a small crucifix, a map of England in her head. Foreign envoys found in her a listener who did not mistake courtesy for surrender. Churchmen found a penitent who asked precise questions about doctrine and vaguer ones about men. Counsellors found a counsellor who could turn a king's instinct into a statute. Women found a patron who noticed talent the way other nobles notice blood. Poor men found bread and sometimes justice. She had learned long ago that to feed a stomach is to buy a little time for a soul to repair itself. The children came as promises do and sometimes left before they could be redeemed. After Arthur's birth, 1486, and Margaret's 1489, another Henry 1491, who would be the famous one, Mary 1496, and Elizabeth, who died small. The Queen Elizabeth of York died in 1503-inch childbed. The cheer of the realm muted to a long winter note. Margaret's grief did not turn inward. It turned outward into the work of steadying a court that had lost the woman who made it feel like home. She stood godmother again. She stood in doorways where children had cried and persuaded them to laugh. She stood between Henry and excessive sorrow of suspicion of taxation whenever the needle swung too far. If you had walked into her chamber at Collie Weston in these years, you would not have thought of queens. You would have found a woman in her early 60s, small, disciplined, smiling without promise. A reader's fingers ink in the creases. The ring that said Richmond, and the other that said Derby. A rosary that had polished itself smooth where her thumb circled it. A stack of petitions, a reeve's complaint, a scholar's plea for a place, an abbess's note about a roof. A draft letter to a bishop whose zeal wanted harness. A list of spoons needed for a feast and their precise weights, because waste is a theological error as well as a social one. And somewhere not far from reach, a child's small shoe kept past usefulness, a reminder of an oath made in blood and kept in paper. Power for her was always a verb to conserve, to repair, to arrange, to prevent. She had no regiment to march, no title that put a crown on her head, and yet rooms turned when she stepped into them. The story we call Tudor is made of pageants and proclamations, yes, but it is also perhaps mostly made of a woman who converted survival into structure. The boy she had brought forth through winter now governed with summer's patience. The house she had built out of broken timber now held. What remained was to teach a restless heir to the same discipline to hand off a kingdom learned slowly to a prince who loved speed. That, and to prepare herself for the last offices of love, to ease the dying of a king, and to bless another crown. Kings die in chambers that try to look like chapels. On the 21st of April 1509, after weeks of thickened breath and council held at a whisper, Henry VII lay in his bed at Richmond Palace with the curtains drawn and the prayers steady. He had outlasted rebellions, accounted every coin twice, married his house to his enemy's daughter, buried that daughter with a self-control that made witnesses pity and admire him in equal measure. Now his body wiry, thrifty, stubborn, refused economy. The last business was done under a crucifix. Executors were named. The boy no longer. A boy would be king. The women around the bed did not fuss. Margaret Beaufort, small and exact as ever, stood at the place where mothers stand, close enough to hear a last word, far enough to let it go. Between a king's last breath and a coronation there is a country to carry. Henry VIII was 17, shining impatient heir not only to a throne but to a ledger of enemies and promises. For 2 measured months Margaret became what she had been rehearsing all her life, a governor without title, a regent in all but name. Documents went out by the king's mother. Council sat and was obeyed because habit is a form of law. Arrears were paid where it would purchase loyalty. Silence purchased elsewhere by the sudden appearance of favour. She arranged what had to be arranged, as if time itself could be organised. The obsequies for Henry VII processions, hearse torches, a solemn river of black winding toward the new Lady Chapel he had built at Westminster, the swift necessary marriage of Henry VIII to Catherine of Aragon on the 11th of June policy turned into liturgy, and the coronation for the 24th of June ordered down to candles and horseshoes, and the number of trenchers laid at each board in Westminster Hall. If you want to see her at the height of her art, watch the City in late June. Cheapside is a stage of arches and painted allegories. Cloth of gold rubs shoulders with the cheaper brocades that make crowds feel included. Fountains run wine because kingship is a story told in liquids as well as laws. The young couple, Henry tall and glowing, Catherine pale and determined, ride through the city's sound like a river through reeds. Someone has counted the bells, so they will not clamour over one another. Someone has chosen the verses the children shout, tested the joins of the triumphal arches, made sure the angels can be raised and lowered without a tangle. That someone sits later out of sight and eats sparingly while the world devours its own excitement. She has already moved pieces for tomorrow who gets thanked, and how loudly which grievance must be recognized before it hardens, where a gift will make a wound, and where a pardon will attach a man by the root. Henry VIII is crowned oil vows acclamation that tries to be unanimity and almost manages it. He is 18 3 days later, the 28th of June, and steps into the age at which the law sees a man with his own eyes. On June 29, Margaret Dees. It is as if she had calculated the precise moment at which her presence would tip from essential to interfering, and chosen to bow out between breaths. The place is fitting the abbot's house at Westminster Chaney Gates, within hearing of the bells whose habits she knew. Bishop John Fisher, her confessor, will preach the funeral sermon soon, and declare a love that sounds like accuracy, that her prayer was a practice, not a pose, that her liberality was measured so it could last, that her piety made order of grief and work of hope. Before the candles sputter, there is the last business of a life lived as a ledger made more beautiful by the sums it held. Wills are opened. Executors Fisher foremost set hands to the tasks she has listed with the care of a woman who knows how paper outlives breath. Her foundations are confirmed, the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at Oxford and Cambridge, stipends so that theology will be taught without panic or patronage. Christ's College at Cambridge, God's house remade into a place where scholarship is a habit and not a fashion. The plan for St. John's money and methods so that when the petitions have gone quiet, her will can go on talking. Printers she favoured will keep stamping piety into the language of homes. Alms she settled into weekly grooves will keep bread arriving where hunger is regular and therefore unremarkable. The poor will not know the name of the woman who feeds them. They will know they are fed. That is a kind of immortality better than statues. Her body lies first in the Abbey's precincts while the realm remembers itself into calm. Then to the Lady Chapel, the stone flower Henry VII raised at the east end of Westminster, where kings pretend at balance between God and ledger, she is borne for burial. Pietro Torrigiano, the Florentine who hammered Henry's own tomb into bronze and majesty, has made her effigy too, not a queen, and yet more than one hands in prayer, face thin and alive with attention, velvet turned into metal so convincing you want to smooth it. The tomb chest is black marble, polished to a seriousness that will not flatter light. On it letters that scholars will finger with a lover's caution, Erasmus's Latin praising the virtues England had learned to believe in because she practiced them. The words are measure and music both. The bones below them need neither. Visitors will come where the steps are always a little cold. They will read the epigraph without absorbing it, and then sometimes read it again because an old sentence can stand up and walk if it finds the right ears. They will notice the date 1509 and count backward to the winter night at Pembroke. They will not hear the scream. Westminster keeps its sounds to itself. But the stone remembers as stone remembers, not with emotion but with endurance. The woman on the tomb gilded bronze folded over piety like a second veil does not wear triumph. She wears completion. It is a different sort of crown. What has she done? It is possible to answer by inventory stabilized a succession in a country that confuses genealogy for providence, taught a son to prefer solvency to spectacle, made of household order a political instrument, founded professorships that outlived 3 reformations, pulled a future king across an ocean of risk by a line as thin as a rosary, turned grief into structures that strangers still live inside. It is also possible to answer more simply, kept her vow. The one made in pain on a January morning in Pembroke when a child was pulled into air and a girl learned the price of politics. She did not call it a vow then because vows are words and she had no words left. She kept it anyway day by day, letter by letter until the equation resolved the boy alive, the crown steady, the country tired but accommodated to peace. Henry VIII will take the system she helped build and wear it like a young man's cloak, swinging handsome, careless with the lining. He will give England music and quarrels, monasteries toppled and ships launched pageants that try to convince the realm that appetite is a policy. The colleges will keep teaching, the tomb will keep shining, the Lady Chapel will go on holding the noise of prayers. People will say later, people always say that Margaret Beaufort was cold. They will mean she did not waste warmth. They will say she was calculating. They will mean she could count. They will say she was pious. They will mean she learned to love God where other comforts failed. The kingdom she left behind prefers results to weather. It should. She taught it that. If you go to Pembroke and stand on the wall, the wind will tell you a story that pretends to be about itself and is really about the rooms it has visited, chambers where a girl barely made of flesh held onto sheets and to God, galleries where courtiers measured one another and found themselves wanting, courts where parchment rearranged loyalties like furniture, a field where a king's crown took a thorn as a hook, a chapel where bronze learned how to pray. What binds them is not fate. It is the work of a person who refused to fall out of her own story, who turned the smallness of a child's body in labor into the vastness of a dynasty's beginning. We began with a scream. Let us end with breath. The quiet breath of a woman at prayer. The long breath of a country that is for a moment not cutting itself on its own fractures. The small breath the mother lets go when the child she has kept alive at such cost finally stands without her hand. The stones in Wales and Westminster listen, as stones do, and keep counsel. The sea below Pembroke keeps up its old argument with rock. Somewhere inside the abbey the black marble does not glow, it endures. And across the whole long story runs a thread anyone can follow if they wish. A girl in winter who became by increments the world could not see until the end, the mother of a king and the architect of a peace.